Hello and welcome. Tonight we journey into the past, to a land of mist-shrouded mountains and cherry blossoms that bloom with a fierce transient beauty. We travel to feudal Japan, a world shaped by honour, discipline and the cold, hard edge of a sword. Our subject is a figure who has captivated the imagination of the world for centuries, the samurai. But the image we hold of the lone warrior wandering a moonlit road, his hand resting on the hilt of his katana, is only a fragment of a much larger, more complex and more human story. It is a story not just of war but of poetry, not just of death, but of a profound and meticulous way of life. By all logic, this class of warriors should be a contradiction. How can a person be both a ruthless killer and a serene poet? How can a society built on the principles of harmony and balance also elevate the professional soldier to its highest echelon? These are the paradoxes that lie at the heart of the samurai. Tonight we will peel back the layers of myth that have accumulated over centuries. We will explore the origins of these warriors, not as noble swordsmen, but as rugged horsemen and archers on a wild frontier. We will follow their transformation into a powerful ruling class, whose lives were governed by an unwritten code of conduct. We will witness their trials in the crucible of a century of civil war, and we will see how they adapted when peace made their primary function obsolete. But before we begin our journey, if you enjoy these explorations into the past, a simple click on the like and subscribe buttons is a wonderful and deeply appreciated way to support the channel. It means a great deal to me, and it ensures our community continues to grow. I'm also always curious to know where in the world, and at what time, you're joining me from tonight. It is a quiet reminder of the threads that connect us across distance and time. Let me know in the comments below, and now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back to a time of shoguns and daimyo, of silent gardens and fortified castles, of the rustle of silk kimonos and the glint of polished steel. Our story takes us to the very heart of what it meant to be a samurai. The story of the samurai does not begin in a pristine dojo, nor with the flash of a perfectly forged katana. It begins much earlier, in the windswept plains and rugged provinces of ancient Japan, a place far from the perfumed halls and intricate courtier politics of the imperial capital in Heian-kyo, which we now know as Kyoto. During the Heian period, beginning in the late 8th century, the emperor was a divine figure, a celestial sovereign, but his actual power was often a delicate and fragile thing. The true authority in the capital was held by powerful aristocratic clans like the Fujiwara, who mastered the art of courtly intrigue, marrying their daughters to emperors and ruling as regents from behind a gilded screen. While the court composed poetry and debated the finer points of calligraphy, the outer provinces were a different world entirely. Here, the emperor's authority was a distant echo. The land was a patchwork of vast, tax-exempt private estates, or shuen, controlled by wealthy nobles and powerful Buddhist monasteries. These estates were the true engines of the Japanese economy, and they needed protection. Not from foreign invaders, but from rival landowners, local chieftains and common bandits. The central government was either unwilling or unable to provide this security, and so a new class of men began to fill the void. They were not yet called samurai. They were provincial warriors, skilled in the arts of mounted combat. Their primary weapon was not the sword, but the bow. These early warriors were, first and foremost, masters of the yumi, the distinctively long, asymmetrical Japanese bow. Their fighting style was known as Kyuba no Michi, or the way of the horse and bow. Imagine them, clad in a boxy, functional armour called oyoroi, which offered excellent protection but was heavy and cumbersome on foot. They were horsemen, thundering across open ground, controlling their steeds with their knees while standing in the stirrups to loose a volley of arrows with deadly precision. They were practical, hardened men, their loyalty pledged not to a distant emperor, but to the local lord who fed them, housed them, and rewarded them with a share of the land they protected. This relationship formed the bedrock of what would become the entire feudal system of Japan. It was a bond of service and reward, of duty and patronage. The word samurai itself originates from the verb saburao, which means to serve or to wait upon. In these early days, that is precisely what they were. Servants, guardians, the strong right arm of a provincial magnate. Their code was not yet the philosophical Bushido of later centuries. It was a pragmatic set of values centered on martial prowess, unwavering courage in battle, and above all, a fierce and personal loyalty to one's master. To betray that loyalty was the ultimate disgrace, a stain upon one's name that could never be washed away. For centuries, this balance of power, a decadent artistic court in the capital and a rising military class in the provinces, held. But it was a fragile equilibrium. The great clans of the capital, in their endless political games, began to hire these provincial warriors as their personal enforcers, bringing the raw, violent power of the countryside into the heart of the city. Two clans, in particular, rose to prominence through their military might, the Taira and the Minamoto. They were distant relatives of the imperial line, nobles who had left the capital to make their fortunes in the provinces, and in doing so had become masters of the new way of war. The inevitable clash came in the middle of the 12th century. The Genpei War, a brutal 5-year conflict between the Taira and the Minamoto, tore Japan apart. This was not a war of courtly manners. It was a raw struggle for the soul of the nation. The tales of this war, immortalized in the epic poem The Tale of the Heike, are filled with breathtaking acts of heroism and heartbreaking tragedy. It was here that the samurai ethos was forged in the fires of battle. We see legendary archers like Nasu no Yoichi, who, on horseback in the surf, shot a fan from the mast of a moving enemy ship with a single arrow. We see moments of profound loyalty as samurai followed their lords into certain death. When the dust settled in 1185, the Minamoto clan stood victorious. Their leader, Minamoto no Yoritomo, did something revolutionary. Instead of moving to the capital to play the games of the court, he established his own military government, the Bakufu, or tent government, far to the east in the seaside town of Kamakura. The emperor remained in Kyoto, a revered but politically powerless figurehead. Yoritomo took the title of Sei Taishogun, or Barbarian Subduing Generalissimo, a title we shortened to shogun. For the first time, Japan was ruled not by courtiers, but by warriors. The Kamakura period had begun, and the samurai were no longer just servants. They were the undisputed masters of the land. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate marked a profound shift in Japanese society. The centre of gravity had moved from the refined aristocratic world of Kyoto to the stark martial world of Kamakura. Power now flowed not from imperial decree or courtly rank, but from the tip of a spear and the edge of a blade. The samurai class, once the hired muscle of the nobility, had become a new aristocracy in its own right, a warrior elite that would dominate the political and cultural landscape of Japan for the next 700 years. Their values, discipline, loyalty, and martial excellence were now the values of the state itself. Life for a samurai under the new regime was a duality of responsibility. On one hand, they were military governors and administrators. High-ranking vassals of the shogun were appointed as constables, shugo, and stewards, jito, tasked with maintaining law and order, collecting taxes, and managing the great estates that were the lifeblood of the economy. This required not just brute force, but a keen understanding of law, logistics, and human psychology. The image of the unthinking warrior is a fiction. A successful samurai had to be a capable ruler, able to command respect both on and off the battlefield. On the other hand, their identity was rooted in constant military readiness. Even in times of relative peace, the threat of rebellion or invasion was ever present. A samurai's daily life was therefore structured around the relentless honing of his martial skills. He would rise early, his day dedicated to a grueling regimen of training. Hours were spent in the saddle, perfecting the art of mounted archery until horse and rider moved as one. He practiced swordsmanship, the movements of the draw, the cut, and the return to the scabbard becoming a single fluid motion, repeated thousands upon thousands of times until it was ingrained in his muscle memory. This era also saw a critical test that would cement the samurai's role as the defenders of Japan. In 1274, and again in 1281, the great Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, having conquered China and Korea, turned his sights on Japan. He amassed two of the largest naval invasion fleets the world had ever seen. The samurai, who had only ever fought other Japanese warriors, were now faced with a terrifying foreign foe. The Mongol forces were a professional, disciplined army, employing crossbows, coordinated infantry tactics, and even explosive grenades, technologies unfamiliar to the Japanese. The samurai fought with desperate courage. They engaged the invaders on the beaches of Kyushu, fighting pitched battles for weeks on end. In both invasion attempts, just as the situation seemed most dire, a massive typhoon descended upon the coast, shattering the Mongol fleets and sending their armies to the bottom of the sea. The Japanese called these storms the kamikaze, the divine winds, believing them to be a sign of heavenly protection. While the typhoons were the decisive factor, the fierce resistance of the samurai had been crucial in holding the Mongols at bay long enough for the storms to arrive. Their victory, however costly, solidified their identity as the sacred guardians of the nation. Yet this victory planted the seeds of the Kamakura shogunate's decline. The shogunate had no new lands to distribute as rewards, for they had fought a defensive war. Many samurai families who had bankrupted themselves to answer the call to arms received little in return, leading to widespread resentment and a weakening of their loyalty to the Kamakura government. This economic strain, coupled with succession disputes and the rising power of provincial lords who felt ignored by the central authority, began to fray the edges of the shogunate's control. The unified front that had repelled the Mongols began to crack from within. During this time, a profound spiritual shift was also taking place within the samurai class. Warriors living on the precipice of life and death sought a philosophy that could provide them with inner strength and equanimity. They found it in a new school of Buddhism that had recently arrived from China, Zen. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on rigorous self-discipline, meditation, zazen, and the attainment of enlightenment through direct experience rather than scholarly texts, resonated deeply with the warrior mindset. It offered a path to mental clarity and composure, teaching a samurai to act spontaneously and decisively, free from the hesitation born of fear or ego. Zen taught the samurai to face mortality with a calm heart. The transience of life, symbolized by the cherry blossom that bloomed so brilliantly for a few short days before scattering to the wind, became a central tenet of their worldview. To die in battle was not a failure, but the fulfillment of one's purpose. This philosophy did not make them fearless, that would be inhuman, but it gave them a framework for mastering their fear, for finding a point of serene stillness in the heart of the most violent storm. The fusion of the warrior's path with Zen principles would become one of the defining characteristics of the samurai ideal. By the early 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate had become a hollow shell. An ambitious emperor, Go-Daigo, saw an opportunity to restore imperial rule. He rallied disgruntled samurai to his cause, and in 1333, the forces loyal to the emperor, led by the brilliant general Ashikaga Takauji, sacked Kamakura, bringing the first shogunate to a fiery end. But the restoration was short-lived. Ashikaga Takauji, seeing the weakness of the imperial court, quickly betrayed the emperor and established his own shogunate in the Muromachi district of Kyoto. The Ashikaga shogunate would preside over a period of immense cultural flowering, but also one of growing political instability, setting the stage for the greatest trial the samurai would ever face. The Ashikaga period was an age of exquisite contradictions. While the political authority of the shogunate was often weak and constantly challenged by powerful provincial lords or daimyo, it was also a time of unparalleled artistic and cultural refinement. The warrior class, now headquartered in the old imperial capital of Kyoto, absorbed the aesthetic sensibilities of the court aristocracy they had displaced. The raw martial culture of Kamakura began to be polished with a new layer of sophistication. It was in this era that the quintessential samurai arts found their mature form, creating a delicate balance between the way of the warrior and the way of the artist. The tea ceremony, or chanoyu, evolved from a simple pastime into a profound spiritual discipline under the influence of Zen masters like Senno Rikyu. For the samurai, the tea room was a sanctuary of peace and equality. Inside its humble walls, warriors would leave their swords at the door, shedding their rank and status to share a moment of tranquility and contemplation. Every gesture, the whisking of the powdered green tea, the selection of the ceramic bowl, the appreciation of a single flower in a vase, was a form of meditation, an exercise in mindfulness and presence. It was a deliberate cultivation of stillness in a life defined by violence. Similarly, the art of flower arranging, ikebana, became a samurai practice. More than just decorative, ikebana was a way of contemplating nature, asymmetry, and the passage of time. The precise arrangement of stems, leaves, and blossoms was an expression of a deeper cosmic order. Calligraphy, shodo, was another essential skill. The way a samurai wielded his brush was seen as a reflection of his inner character. The bold, fluid strokes required the same combination of intense focus, discipline, and decisive action as a sword cut. In each of these arts, the samurai was not merely creating something beautiful. He was forging his own spirit. This was the era that gave rise to the idealized concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Though the term itself would not be formally codified until the peaceful Edo period, its core principles were being shaped and refined here. These were the virtues that a samurai was expected to embody. First and foremost was gi, or justice and integrity, the ability to make the right decision with an unwavering moral compass. Next was yu, heroic courage, not just the absence of fear, but the ability to act justly in the face of danger. Jin, or benevolence, mandated compassion, especially towards the weak and defeated. Then came rei, or respect and proper conduct, which dictated the intricate etiquette governing a samurai's interactions with those above and below him. Makoto, or honesty and sincerity, meant that a samurai's word was his bond, inviolable and absolute. Meiyo, or honour, was the very core of his identity, a deep awareness of his personal dignity and reputation. And finally, chugi, or loyalty, was the cornerstone that held the entire structure together, an absolute selfless devotion to one's lord that transcended all other obligations, even family and life itself. To live by these virtues was the goal, to die for them was an honour. However, this flourishing of high culture and philosophy existed against a backdrop of increasing political decay. The Ashikaga shoguns lost their grip on the powerful daimyo, who began to rule their domains like independent kings. They built massive fortified castles, raised private armies, and warred constantly with their neighbours. The bond of loyalty, so idealised in theory, was frequently broken in practice. Ambitious vassals betrayed their masters, sons turned against their fathers, and brother fought brother in a ruthless struggle for land and power. The refined ideals of Kyoto were often a distant dream in the blood-soaked provinces. The slow unravelling of central authority culminated in the Oniin War, a decade-long conflict that began in 1467 over a succession dispute within the Ashikaga clan. The war turned the magnificent city of Kyoto into a smouldering ruin. Temples, palaces, and priceless works of art were consumed by flames. The authority of the shogunate was shattered beyond repair. When the war finally sputtered to an end, there was no victor, only chaos. Japan had descended into a dark and violent period that would last for more than a century, an age known as the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the country at war. For the samurai, this was the ultimate trial by fire. The age of art and philosophy was over. The age of survival had begun. The Sengoku Jidai was a century of ceaseless, brutal warfare. The Japanese archipelago fractured into hundreds of warring fiefdoms, each ruled by a powerful daimyo hungry for supremacy. The concept of a unified nation all but vanished, replaced by a Darwinian landscape, where only the strong, the cunning, and the ruthless could survive. For the samurai class, this was both their darkest hour and their defining moment. The theoretical virtues of Bushido were now tested daily on the battlefield, and the reality was often far grimmer than the ideal. A samurai's life expectancy plummeted, and his existence became a relentless cycle of marching, training, and fighting. The nature of warfare itself underwent a dramatic transformation. The formal, almost ritualistic single combats between high-ranking samurai that characterized earlier conflicts gave way to a more pragmatic and brutal form of mass warfare. Large armies, composed not just of samurai but also of peasant foot soldiers called a shigeru, clashed in enormous, chaotic battles. Strategy and logistics became paramount. The daimyo who succeeded were not necessarily the bravest warriors, but the most brilliant organisers and tacticians, men who could manage supply lines, employ spies, and master the complex art of siegecraft. Castle design evolved rapidly to meet the new challenges. The simple fortifications of the past were replaced by massive multi-tiered stone fortresses, ingeniously designed with confusing layouts, hidden passages, and overlapping fields of fire. The siege of a castle became a grim, protracted affair, a contest of engineering, starvation, and psychological warfare. A samurai's duties expanded beyond the battlefield. He might be called upon to oversee the construction of fortifications, command a garrison, or lead a desperate nighttime raid to burn an enemy's supplies. Then, in 1543, a new and terrible weapon arrived on Japan's shores. A Chinese junk carrying Portuguese traders shipwrecked off the island of Tanegashima. Among their cargo were matchlock muskets, or arquebuses. The local daimyo was fascinated by these fire sticks, and immediately purchased them, ordering his swordsmiths to replicate the technology. The Japanese, being master metalworkers, quickly succeeded. Within a decade, firearms were being mass-produced and were spreading across the country like wildfire, forever changing the face of samurai warfare. The introduction of the firearm was a profound shock to the samurai ethos. The sword was the soul of the samurai, its mastery the result of a lifetime of spiritual and physical discipline. The bow, too, required immense skill. But the musket was different. It was an impersonal mechanical weapon that could be mastered by an ordinary peasant with a few weeks of training. A well-drilled unit of a Shigeru musketeers could now stand their ground against a charge of the most elite samurai cavalry, felling noble warriors from a distance with a deafening roar and a cloud of black smoke. It seemed a dishonourable, cowardly way to fight. Yet the most pragmatic daimyo recognised the gun's potential immediately. The greatest of these was Oda, Nobunaga, a brilliant, ruthless, and innovative leader who was one of the first to fully embrace firearms tactics. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, his army faced the formidable cavalry of the Takeda clan, widely considered the most powerful warriors in Japan. Nobunaga did the unthinkable. He arrayed his 3,000 Shigeru musketeers behind wooden palisades and had them fire in rotating volleys, creating a continuous storm of lead. The legendary Takeda cavalry charged again and again, and again and again they were cut down. It was a massacre, and it signalled the end of the old way of war. The samurai who refused to adapt were destined for extinction. Loyalty, the theoretical bedrock of the samurai code, became a precious and fragile commodity in this era. The Japanese saying Gekokujo, the low overthrow the high, became the unofficial motto of the age. Ambitious retainers assassinated their own lords to seize power. Alliances were made and broken with breathtaking speed. A samurai's trust was his most vulnerable point, and betrayal was an ever-present threat. To survive, a warrior needed to be not only brave but also politically astute, able to navigate a treacherous world of shifting allegiances and hidden agendas. The pure, unwavering loyalty of the epics was a luxury few could afford. The experience of battle was a visceral, terrifying ordeal. Before a campaign, rituals were performed to purify the mind and body. A samurai might compose a death poem, a final testament to his worldview, accepting his own mortality. He would don his armour, a complex process that was itself a ritual, piece by piece transforming him from a man into a warrior. The armour was often ornate with fierce masks, menyo, designed to intimidate the enemy and protect the face. On his helmet he might wear a striking crest, or May date, representing a dragon, a demon, or a family emblem, making him identifiable in the chaos of the fight. The battlefield was a sensory inferno. The air was thick with the din of war drums, the blast of conch shell trumpets, the thunder of musketry, the screams of the wounded, and the roar of thousands of men clashing. It was a maelstrom of mud, blood, and steel. In the heart of this chaos, the samurai fought with sword, spear, and dagger. Victory was often measured in a grim currency, the severed heads of enemies. After a battle, a samurai would present the heads he had taken to his lord for inspection and reward. Each head would be carefully cleaned, its hair combed and arranged, and tagged with the name of the vanquished foe and the victor. It was a gruesome but essential part of the martial economy of the Sengoku Jidai. Out of this century of chaos, 3 extraordinary leaders emerged who would ultimately unify Japan. The first was the audacious Oda Nobunaga, who, through ruthless conquest and strategic genius, brought nearly a third of the country under his control before being betrayed and forced to commit ritual suicide, or seppuku. His top general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of humble peasant origins, rose to complete Nobunaga's work, unifying all of Japan through a brilliant mix of military conquest and shrewd diplomacy. After Hideyoshi's death, his most powerful vassal, the patient and cunning Tokugawa Ieyasu, consolidated his power, winning the decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. 3 years later, he was appointed shogun by the emperor, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. The age of the country at war was finally over. A new era of peace was about to begin, and with it, a profound identity crisis for the samurai. The establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603 was a watershed moment in Japanese history. After more than a century of relentless civil war, Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors imposed a rigid and lasting peace upon the nation. Japan turned inward, sealing its borders to most of the outside world in an act of national seclusion known as Sakoku. For the next 2.5 centuries, the land would be free from the turmoil of both internal conflict and foreign invasion. This was the Great Peace, the Edo period, and for the samurai class, it was a time of profound and difficult transformation. Their very reason for being, war, had been rendered obsolete. The Tokugawa regime, in its quest for stability, created a meticulously ordered society based on a strict Neo-Confucian hierarchy. At the very top were the samurai, the ruling elite. Below them were the farmers, who produced the nation's food, then the artisans, who created its goods, and at the very bottom were the merchants, who were seen as unproductive parasites because they profited from the labour of others. This social structure was legally enforced and hereditary. A samurai was born a samurai, and a farmer was born a farmer. There was to be no more of the social mobility that had defined the Sengoku Jidai, where a peasant like Hideyoshi could rise to become the ruler of all Japan. With no wars to fight, the samurai were forced to evolve. They transitioned from warriors into a caste of civil administrators, bureaucrats, and scholars. They managed the vast domains of their daimyo, collected taxes, enforced laws, and filled the ranks of the sprawling government bureaucracy in the new capital city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo. The skills required for success were no longer prowess with a spear, but proficiency with a brush. Literacy, knowledge of legal codes, and an understanding of economics became more valuable than a mastery of swordsmanship. The warrior had become a functionary. This new reality created a deep-seated anxiety within the samurai class. How could they maintain their martial identity in an age of peace? The answer was found in the formalization and idealization of their warrior code. It was during the peaceful Edo period that the concept of Bushido was truly born, articulated in texts like Yamamoto Tsunetomo's Hagakure. This was Bushido not as a practical guide for the battlefield, but as a moral and spiritual philosophy for life. It became a nostalgic, romanticized vision of a bygone era, emphasizing an almost fanatical loyalty, a stoic acceptance of hardship, and a readiness to die at a moment's notice, even when there was no cause for which to die. The martial arts, or bujutsu, also transformed. They were no longer practiced as techniques for battlefield survival, but as budo, martial ways or paths for spiritual and personal development. Great schools of swordsmanship, like the Yagyu Shinkage-ryu, shifted their focus from merely teaching how to kill to cultivating discipline, focus, and moral character. The practice of kenjutsu, the art of the sword, became a moving meditation, a quest for perfection of form and spirit. The dojo became the new battlefield, a place where a samurai fought not an external enemy, but his own internal weaknesses and ego. Despite their lofty social status, many samurai faced severe economic hardship during the Edo period. Their income was a fixed stipend, paid by their lord in rice, based on a land value system established generations earlier. However, the Japanese economy was rapidly changing. A vibrant cash economy, driven by the despised but increasingly wealthy merchant class, was flourishing in the cities. As the cost of living rose, the real value of the samurai's rice stipend declined. Many fell into debt to rice brokers and merchants, forcing them to take on side jobs or marry their daughters into merchant families, a humiliating necessity that blurred the rigid class lines. The sight of a samurai, his two swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, tucked into his belt as a symbol of his rank, living in genteel poverty became increasingly common. This economic frustration sometimes boiled over. Masterless samurai known as ronin became a fixture of the era. These were men whose lords had been dispossessed or who had been dismissed from service. They wandered the country, looking for work as bodyguards, teachers, or in some cases turning to banditry. They were a potent symbol of the decay within the samurai class, men with the training of a warrior but no master to serve and no war to fight. The most famous story of this era, one that became a foundational legend of Japanese culture, is that of the 47 Ronin. In 1701, a provincial lord named Asano Naganori was provoked into drawing his sword within the shogun's castle, a capital offence, and was forced to commit seppuku. His domain was confiscated, and his samurai became ronin. 47 of his most loyal retainers, led by Oishi Kuranosuke, spent 2 years plotting in secret, feigning drunkenness and debauchery to throw off suspicion. Then, on a snowy winter night, they launched a surprise attack on the mansion of the official who had insulted their master, killing him and taking his head. Having achieved their revenge, they turned themselves in to the authorities. The shogunate faced a dilemma. The Ronin had broken the law by carrying out a private vendetta, but they had also perfectly embodied the samurai ideal of loyalty. After much debate, the shogun allowed them the honour of committing seppuku rather than being executed as common criminals. The story was an immediate sensation, immortalised in countless plays, poems and woodblock prints. It resonated so deeply because it was a powerful, tragic affirmation of the samurai spirit in an age where that spirit seemed to have lost its purpose. It was a beautiful, bloody act of nostalgia. For 2.5 centuries, Japan slumbered in this Tokugawa peace, a meticulously ordered world where the samurai reigned as a privileged but increasingly anachronistic class. They were living museum pieces, masters of a forgotten art, their swords becoming more ceremonial than functional. But beyond the sealed borders, the world was changing at a furious pace. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the West, and new powers with new technologies were expanding their empires across the globe. The divine winds that had saved Japan from the Mongols would not be able to hold back the tide that was coming. The long peace was about to be shattered, and with it the world of the samurai would come to a final dramatic end. The year is 1853. Into the calm waters of Edo Bay sails a squadron of warships, utterly alien in their appearance. They are not the graceful wooden vessels of Japan, but massive black-hulled steam frigates, belching smoke into the sky and moving against the wind with an unnatural power. These are the Black Ships of the United States Navy, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. His mission is simple and non-negotiable: to force Japan to open its borders to American trade, using the threat of his ships' powerful cannons to punctuate his request. For a nation that had lived in self-imposed isolation for over 200 years, it was as if visitors from another planet had arrived. The arrival of the Black Ship sent a seismic shockwave through every level of Japanese society. It was a profound humiliation. The Tokugawa shogunate, the military government whose primary justification for rule was its ability to protect the nation, was utterly powerless against this foreign technology. They were forced to sign unequal treaties with the United States and other Western powers, opening ports and granting them special privileges. To many samurai, especially in the powerful outer domains of Satsuma and Choshu, this was an unforgivable act of weakness. It proved that the Tokugawa regime was no longer fit to lead. A powerful and violent movement arose, centered on the slogan Sono Joy: revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. This was a call to overthrow the failing shogunate and restore direct political power to the emperor in Kyoto, who had been a symbolic figurehead for centuries. It was a deeply nationalistic and xenophobic movement, and samurai were its fiercest adherents. Young, idealistic warriors left their domains, becoming radicalized activists or shishi, who engaged in political assassinations of shogunate officials and foreigners alike. The streets of Kyoto once again ran with blood, as samurai fought samurai in a shadowy war over the future of their nation. The shogunate fought back, unleashing its own police forces, like the infamous Shinsengumi, to hunt down and eliminate the rebel shishi. Yet the tide of history was against them. The leaders of the Satsuma and Choshu domains, initially the most ardent proponents of expelling the barbarians, came to a pragmatic realization after a few disastrous military encounters with Western naval power. They understood that Japan could not resist the West with swords and spears. The only way to protect Japan's sovereignty was to embrace the very technology of the enemy, to modernize, to industrialize, and to build a powerful Western-style army and navy. Sono Joy was replaced by a new slogan, Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the army. In 1867, the pressure became unbearable. The last Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, formally abdicated, returning political power to the young Emperor Meiji. This event, known as the Meiji Restoration, was not so much a restoration as it was a revolution, a coup d'etat orchestrated by the ambitious samurai of the Western domains. They had triumphed. The shogunate was no more, but in their victory they had unleashed a force of change that would ultimately consume them. They had set out to save the world of the samurai, but they would end up destroying it. The new Meiji government, composed largely of these same ex-samurai, embarked on a breathtakingly rapid program of modernization. They looked to the West and began to dismantle the feudal system that had defined Japan for centuries. The domains were abolished and replaced with prefectures controlled by the central government. The rigid four-tiered class system was dissolved. All Japanese were now, in theory, equal citizens, and in a series of shocking decrees, the new government struck at the very heart of the samurai identity. First, they created a national conscript army, modelled on the Prussian system. The defence of the nation was no longer the exclusive privilege of the samurai class. It was now the duty of every able-bodied male citizen, regardless of his birth. A peasant farmer, armed with a modern rifle, was now considered a soldier of Japan. Then, the government commuted the samurai's traditional rice stipends into lump sum payments of government bonds, a move that severed their last economic tie to the old feudal order and pushed many into financial ruin. The final, most symbolic blow came in 1876 with the Haitorai Edict. This law banned the wearing of swords in public by anyone other than members of the new national military and police. The daisho, the paired katana and wakizashi, had been the ultimate symbol of samurai status for centuries. It was the physical manifestation of their honour, their privilege, and their soul. To be stripped of their swords was to be stripped of their very identity. In the space of less than a decade, the samurai class had been legislated out of existence. They had gone from being the undisputed rulers of Japan to an obsolete relic of a bygone age. For many former samurai, this was too much to bear. Discontent simmered, particularly in the proud domain of Satsuma, which had been instrumental in the Meiji Restoration but now felt betrayed by its radical policies. Their frustration found a leader in Saigo Takamori, one of the most heroic and respected figures of the Restoration. He was a man torn between two worlds, a brilliant modern military strategist, who was also a deeply traditional samurai at heart. He had withdrawn from the government in protest and returned to his home in Satsuma, where he became a living legend, the embodiment of the fading samurai spirit. In 1877, a dispute with the central government escalated, and Saigo's followers, thousands of disgruntled ex-samurai, rose up in what became known as the Satsuma Rebellion. It was the last stand of the samurai. Saigo, a reluctant leader, found himself at the head of an army fighting against the very government he had helped create. His traditional samurai warriors, armed with swords and old muskets, faced the new imperial Japanese army, a conscript force of commoners armed with modern rifles and artillery, supported by a network of railways and telegraphs. The rebellion was doomed from the start. It was a battle of the past against the future. For months, the The Satsuma rebels fought with incredible bravery and skill, but they were relentlessly pushed back by the superior numbers and firepower of the national army. The final battle took place at Shiroyama, a hill overlooking the city of Kagoshima. Here, Saigo and his last few hundred loyal followers were surrounded. In the pre-dawn darkness, they drew their swords and launched one final desperate charge into the teeth of the enemy's guns. They were cut down by a hail of bullets. Saigo Takamori, severely wounded, was carried to a quiet spot by a loyal retainer, where he committed seppuku in the traditional samurai manner. With his death, the Satsuma rebellion was over, and the last flicker of armed samurai resistance was extinguished. The age of the samurai, an era that had spanned 700 years, had come to a definitive and tragic end, not at the hands of a foreign invader, but in a battle against their own countrymen on a hillside in southern Japan. And so, the age of the warrior came to a close. But to truly understand what was lost on that smoke-filled hill at Shiroyama, to grasp the weight of 7 centuries of tradition, we must now turn back from the grand sweep of history. We must look closer into the intricate details and the quiet rituals that compose the very fabric of the samurai's world. Our journey is not over. We must now explore the inner life of the warrior, beginning with the object that was not merely his weapon, but the physical manifestation of his soul. Let us now consider the sword. To the samurai, the sword was never just a tool of war. It was a work of art, a sacred object and a family heirloom, passed down through generations as a vessel of ancestral honour. The bond between a warrior and his blade was deeply personal, almost mystical. The paired swords, the long katana, and the shorter wakizashi, known collectively as the daisho, were the exclusive right of the samurai class, a visible badge of their status that set them apart from all other members of society. To touch a samurai's sword without permission was a grave insult, often punishable by immediate death. It was considered an extension of his being, a mirror to his spirit. The creation of a katana was itself a profound spiritual act, a process steeped in Shinto ritual and Zen discipline. The swordsmith was not a mere craftsman. He was a priest, an artist, and a master metallurgist. Before forging a blade, he would undergo rites of purification, dressing in white priestly robes and adorning his forge with sacred rice straw ropes, or shimenawa, to ward off evil spirits and create a sacred space. The work was an act of prayer, a collaboration between man, fire, and steel to create an object of both lethal purpose and sublime beauty. The process began with a special type of steel known as tamahagain, or jewel steel, smelted over days in a massive clay furnace called a tatara. This steel was incredibly pure but had an uneven carbon content. The smith's first task was to forge weld chunks of this steel together, hammering them flat, folding them over and welding them again. This folding process was repeated a dozen times or more, creating thousands of paper-thin layers within the blade. This layering served 2 purposes. It distributed the carbon evenly for a consistent strength, and it removed impurities, which were hammered out as sparks with each blow. It was this meticulous folding that created the blade's distinctive grain pattern, or jihada, a subtle, wood-like texture on the surface of the steel that was unique to each sword. The true genius of the Japanese sword, however, lay in a process known as differential hardening. The smith would coat the blade in a thick secret mixture of clay, charcoal powder, and other ingredients. He would apply a thinner layer along the cutting edge and a much thicker layer along the spine and sides. The sword was then heated to a precise temperature, a moment judged by the smith not by a thermometer, but by the glowing colour of the steel in the dim light of the forge, a colour often compared to the colour of the morning moon. When the moment was perfect, he would plunge the blade into a trough of water. The thin layer of clay on the edge allowed it to cool almost instantly, transforming the steel into an incredibly hard, crystalline structure, called martensite, capable of holding a razor-sharp edge. The thick clay on the spine, however, insulated the steel, causing it to cool much more slowly, forming a softer, more flexible pearlite structure. This created a blade that was a masterpiece of composite engineering. It had a glass-hard, brittle edge for cutting, supported by a tough shock-absorbent spine that prevented the sword from shattering on impact. The boundary line between these two types of steel created a beautiful, cloud-like or wave-like pattern along the edge known as the hamen, the signature of the smith and the most prominent feature of a masterwork blade. After the forging and hardening, the blade was handed over to a succession of other master craftsmen. A polisher would spend weeks, sometimes months, meticulously rubbing the blade with a series of progressively finer stones, bringing out the beauty of the hamon and jihada, and honing the edge to legendary sharpness. The process was not one of grinding, but of patient artistry, revealing the inner life of the steel. Meanwhile, other artisans would create the scabbard, or saya, often a work of lacquered art. The hilt, or tsuka, wrapped in the rough skin of a rayfish for grip and then bound with intricate silk cord. And the guard, or tsuba, which was often a miniature masterpiece of metal sculpture, depicting dragons, landscapes, or scenes from mythology. The finished sword was more than the sum of its parts. It was a perfect balance of form and function, of deadly purpose and profound beauty. Great swords were given names, and the most famous smiths, like the legendary Masamune and his reputedly cursed and bloodthirsty rival Muramasa, became figures of myth. A blade made by Masamune was said to be the sword of a guardian, a noble weapon that would not cut an innocent, while a Muramasa blade was believed to possess a demonic thirst for blood, capable of driving its owner to violence. These legends speak to the deep psychological power the sword held in the samurai imagination. To wield such a weapon required a lifetime of training. The art of swordsmanship, or kenjutsu, was a core component of a samurai's education. He learned not just how to cut, but how to draw the sword, how to move, how to breathe, how to read an opponent's intention. The schools of swordsmanship were numerous, each with its own philosophy and secret techniques. Some focused on lightning-fast attacks, like the famous Tsubame Gaishi, or swallow cut, of the legendary swordsman Sasaki Kojiro. Others emphasized strategy and psychological dominance, like the School of No Sword, founded by the master Tsukahara Bokuden, which taught that the ultimate victory was to defeat an opponent without ever drawing one's blade. Perhaps the most famous swordsman of all was Miyamoto Musashi, a ronin who fought and won over 60 duels in his lifetime, often using a wooden sword against a live blade. In his later years, he wrote The Book of Five Rings, a treatise on strategy that has been studied for centuries not just by martial artists but by business executives and military leaders. For Musashi, the way of the sword was a microcosm for all of life. It was about perceiving the truth of a situation, adapting to circumstances, and acting with absolute decisiveness and a calm, untroubled spirit. The ultimate goal was to achieve a state of mushin, or no mind, where the body acts perfectly and spontaneously, without the interference of conscious thought or emotion. The sword was also a tool for the samurai's final and most personal ritual, seppuku. The shorter wakizashi was sometimes referred to as the guardian of one's honour, for it was this blade that would be used to perform the act of ritual suicide. The act was not one of despair, but a final assertion of samurai will, a way to accept responsibility for failure, to protest an injustice, or to follow a master into death. The ritual was highly codified, a last display of courage and self-control. To be able to perform the deep, precise cuts to one's own abdomen in a state of perfect composure was seen as the ultimate expression of the samurai spirit. Even in the long peace of the Edo period, when swords were rarely drawn in combat, their symbolic importance only grew. The sword became an icon of a romanticized past, a constant reminder to the samurai bureaucrat of his martial heritage. It was the anchor of his identity in a changing world. And so, when the Meiji government decreed that the swords could no longer be worn, it was an act of profound symbolic violence. It was not merely disarming a class of men, it was silencing their souls, severing the last tangible link to the 700 years of honour, bloodshed, and artistry that the blade represented. Just as the sword was the soul of the warrior, his armour, or yoroi, was his second skin. It was his fortress, his war face, and a vibrant declaration of his identity on the chaotic battlefield. The evolution of samurai armour is a story that mirrors the evolution of their fighting style, a constant conversation between technology, tactics, and aesthetics. Like the sword, it was far more than simple protection. It was a complex work of art, designed not only to stop a blade or an arrow, but also to project an aura of power and inspire terror in the hearts of one's enemies. The earliest form of classic samurai armour, perfected during the Heian and Kamakura periods, was the Oyuroi, or great armour. This was a suit built for a single purpose: combat on horseback with a bow. It was a heavy, box-like construction, composed of thousands of tiny individual scales of lacquered iron or leather called kozane, which were painstakingly laced together with brightly coloured silk or leather cords. This construction made the armour remarkably flexible, allowing for the full range of motion needed to draw a longbow from the saddle. The Oyuroi was not designed to fit snugly. It hung from the shoulders, with its weight distributed to allow the warrior to stand in his stirrups and twist his torso as he aimed and fired. It featured large rectangular shoulder guards, or sode, which functioned like mobile shields, protecting the upper arms and back from arrows. The front of the cuirass or do was covered by a solid leather-wrapped plate to prevent the bowstring from snagging. It was a magnificent but cumbersome suit, offering superb protection for a mounted archer, but it was incredibly heavy and awkward for fighting on foot. If a samurai was unhorsed in an Oyuroi, he was at a severe disadvantage. As the nature of warfare shifted away from aristocratic mounted archery towards massed infantry tactics during the turbulent Sengoku Jidai, the armour had to adapt. The Oyuroi was too expensive and time-consuming to produce for the new, larger armies, and it was ill-suited for foot soldiers. This led to the development of the Tosei Gusoku, or modern armour. This new style was a triumph of pragmatic design. Instead of thousands of tiny scales, it was constructed from larger solid plates of iron, riveted or hinged together. This made the armour lighter, cheaper to produce, and more form-fitting, offering better protection and mobility for ground combat. The Tosei Gusoku was also designed with a new threat in mind: firearms. The smooth, curved surfaces of its cuirass were intended to deflect musket balls, and some high-quality suits were even bullet-tested, bearing the honourable dents, or tameshi, to prove their resilience. This new style of armour was highly modular. A high-ranking samurai might wear a full ornate suit, while a common Ashigaru foot soldier might only be issued with a simple cuirass and a conical helmet, or jingasa. Perhaps the most iconic and expressive element of any suit of armour was the helmet, or kabuto. It was here that a samurai's individuality and his lord's identity were most powerfully displayed. The bowl of the helmet was typically made from several triangular iron plates, meticulously riveted together to form a strong, resilient dome. A neck guard or shikoro made of tiered lacquered plates swept down from the back of the bowl to protect the neck and shoulders. On the front, a samurai would wear his family crest, or mon, a simple, elegant emblem that identified his lineage, but it was the ornamentation that truly set the kabuto apart. Attached to the front was the May-date, a crest that could be anything from a simple pair of stylized buffalo horns to an elaborate three-dimensional sculpture of a dragon, a Buddhist deity, or even a dragonfly, which was admired for its ability to fly forwards and backwards, but never sideways, symbolizing a warrior who would never retreat. During the flamboyant Momoyama period, which preceded the Tokugawa peace, some daimyo commissioned bizarre and fantastical helmets known as kawari kabuto, or strange helmets, shaped like seashells, rabbit's ears, or even the Chinese character for front, designed to make them stand out and be instantly recognizable amidst the chaos of battle. Completing the fearsome visage was the mask, or menyo. These were iron masks, often lacquered in red or black, that protected the face while being sculpted into terrifying expressions. Some were the snarling faces of demons, oni, or mischievous spirits, tengu, with bristling horsehair moustaches and gilded teeth. These masks served a practical purpose, anchoring the helmet's cords and protecting the face, but their psychological impact was just as important. To face a samurai in full armour, his face a demonic iron scowl, his helmet crowned with a fearsome beast, was to face a figure that seemed more supernatural than human. The entire suit of armour was a tapestry of materials. Underneath the iron and silk, a samurai wore a brocade kimono and baggy trousers. His arms and shins were protected by armoured sleeves and greaves. He wore bearskin boots for warmth and grip. Every piece was carefully chosen and tied together with a complex system of knots and cords. The process of donning a full suit of armour was a time-consuming ritual, often requiring the assistance of a servant. As each piece was secured, the samurai underwent a mental transformation, leaving behind the man of peace and becoming a vessel of war. The colours of the silk lacing, or odoshi ito, were not merely decorative. They often had symbolic meanings or served to identify different units within an army. A commander could survey the battlefield and, by the colour and patterns of the lacing on his soldier's armour, instantly understand the disposition of his forces. It was a form of battlefield heraldry, a visual language written in silk and steel that brought a semblance of order to the chaos of combat. In the long peace of the Edo period, armour, like the sword, became largely ceremonial. The great suits of Oyoroi were brought out of storage and proudly displayed in the homes of daimyo, relics of a more heroic age. The craftsmanship became even more elaborate and decorative, as armour was now made for parades and processions rather than for battle, but it never lost its symbolic power. It was a tangible link to a warrior ancestry, a constant reminder of the martial prowess upon which the samurai's entire social standing was built. To see a suit of armour, standing silent and empty in a dimly lit hall, is to feel the presence of the warrior who once inhabited it, and to sense the weight of the violent and beautiful world he was sworn to defend. Away from the battlefield and the training dojo, the samurai's life was governed by the same principles of discipline, order, and aesthetic sensibility. His home was not merely a shelter, but a reflection of his world view, a carefully constructed environment designed to foster tranquility and mindfulness. The traditional samurai residence, or bukiyashiki, was a testament to the beauty of simplicity, a world away from the stone castles of Europe. It was a place of natural materials, subtle light, and a deep connection to the surrounding environment. The home was typically a single-storey wooden structure, built around a central courtyard or garden. The walls were not solid barriers, but a system of sliding screens. The outer screens, or amado, were made of wood and could be sealed at night or during a storm. The inner walls were composed of shoji, light wooden lattices covered in translucent rice paper, which allowed a soft, diffused light to fill the rooms. These screens could be opened or removed entirely, blurring the boundary between inside and outside, and allowing the house to be reconfigured for different purposes. This created a sense of fluidity and impermanence, a physical manifestation of the Buddhist concept that all things are transient. The floors were covered with tatami, thick mats made of woven rush laid over a rice straw core. The size of a room was measured by the number of tatami mats it contained. These mats were a standardized size, creating a sense of proportion and harmony throughout the entire house. Life was lived on the floor. One sat on silk cushions or zabuton, ate from low-lacquered tables, and slept on futons that were rolled up and stored in closets during the day, freeing the room for other uses. To walk on tatami with shoes was an unthinkable breach of etiquette, a desecration of the clean, ordered space of the home. In the main reception room there was almost always a tokonoma, a small raised alcove that was the aesthetic focal point of the house. This was a sacred space where the family's most precious art objects were displayed. A single, masterfully painted scroll, or kakemono, would hang on the back wall, its subject chosen to reflect the current season or a special occasion. Below it, on the raised floor, might sit a single exquisite example of ikebana, the art of flower arranging, its sparse, asymmetrical beauty inviting contemplation. The contents of the tokonoma were changed regularly, a quiet ritual that marked the passing of the seasons and maintained a sense of freshness and mindfulness in the home. The garden was not an afterthought, but an integral part of the residence, a carefully composed landscape designed to be viewed from within the house as if it were a living painting. The Japanese garden was a microcosm of nature, not a domination of it. Rocks were carefully selected and placed to suggest mountains and islands, raked white sand represented the ocean, and meticulously pruned trees evoked the feeling of a dense forest. Moss, with its subtle textures and deep green colour, was highly prized. The goal was to create a scene of serene natural beauty that would calm the mind and encourage meditation. For a samurai, whose life could be one of extreme violence, the garden was a vital sanctuary of peace. The diet of a samurai was for the most part simple, healthy and seasonal. The staple of every meal was rice. Indeed, rice was more than food. It was the measure of wealth. A samurai's rank and income were not measured in currency, but in koku, a unit of volume representing the amount of rice needed to feed one person for 1 year. A powerful daimyo might have a domain valued at 100,000 koku, while a low-ranking samurai might receive a stipend of less than 10. This rice was the foundation of his family's diet, supplemented with fish, seaweed, seasonal vegetables and pickles. Meat was rarely eaten, due to a combination of Buddhist prohibitions and the simple fact that livestock was not widely raised for food. Meals were a formal affair, governed by a strict etiquette. Each dish was served in its own small bowl or plate, with careful attention paid to the colour, texture and arrangement of the food. The presentation was as important as the taste, an expression of the same aesthetic principles that governed flower arranging and painting. The act of eating was to be done with mindfulness and gratitude. Family life within the samurai household was hierarchical and patriarchal. The master of the house held absolute authority. His wife, while subservient to him, was a figure of considerable power and responsibility within the domestic sphere. It was she who managed the household finances, oversaw the servants, and was responsible for the education of the children. It was a common saying that a samurai's wife needed to know how to manage a domain, even if her domain was only the size of a tatami mat. Samurai women were not the delicate wilting flowers of Western romanticism. They were expected to be as stoic and disciplined as their husbands. Many were trained in the martial arts, particularly with the naginata, a long polearm with a curved blade at its tip. This was considered a suitable weapon for women, as its length allowed them to keep a male attacker, who would likely be armed with a shorter sword at a distance. In a time of war, if their husband's castle was under siege, it was the duty of the women to defend their home to the death. The ideal samurai wife was one who could manage a household with grace and efficiency, and if necessary, take up a weapon and fight with the courage of any warrior. Marriage was rarely a matter of love, it was a strategic alliance. Marriages were arranged by parents to strengthen ties between families, secure a political advantage, or improve one's social standing. A wife's primary duty was to produce a male heir to continue the family line. If she failed to do so, her husband could take a concubine or, in some cases, divorce her. Despite this, genuine affection and deep partnerships certainly existed, but the foundation of the institution was pragmatic and political. The education of a samurai son was rigorous. From a young age he was steeped in the martial arts, his days filled with training in swordsmanship, archery and jujutsu. But his education was not limited to the arts of war. He was also expected to be literate and cultured. He would spend hours studying the Chinese classics, learning Confucian ethics, practicing calligraphy, and composing poetry. This duality was central to the samurai ideal, to be bunbu ryodo, the twofold way of the literary and martial arts. The ideal samurai was not an unthinking brute, but a scholar warrior, a man who could command an army as skillfully as he could compose a verse. Even a samurai's appearance was a carefully controlled expression of his status and discipline. His most distinctive feature was his hairstyle, the shonmage. The top of the head was shaved, and the remaining hair on the sides and back was oiled, combed into a queue, and then folded forward over the crown. This hairstyle had a practical origin. It helped to keep a helmet securely in place, but during the Edo period, it became a mandatory symbol of samurai rank. To lose one's top knot was a sign of deep disgrace. This world, from the layout of a room to the arrangement of food on a plate to the style of one's hair, was a testament to the samurai belief that discipline, order, and beauty were not separate spheres, but were interwoven into a single, unified way of life. Central to this meticulously ordered world was an unwritten, and for centuries uncodified, set of principles that guided a samurai's every action. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was more than a code of ethics. It was a comprehensive philosophy of life and death, a spiritual compass that gave meaning to a warrior's existence. While its ideals were forged in the heat of the Kamakura and Sengoku periods, it was during the long peace of the Edo shogunate that it was truly defined and romanticized, becoming the soul of the samurai class in an age when their martial function had all but disappeared. Let us now walk the path of this code and examine its core virtues, for to understand Bushido is to understand the inner turmoil and the highest aspirations of the samurai. The first and most important pillar was gi, which translates as righteousness, justice, or moral integrity. Gi was the power to decide upon a course of conduct in accordance with reason, without wavering. It was the ability to see the right path and to walk it, even when it was the harder choice. A true samurai was to despise cowardly or deceitful means. For him, a promise made was an unbreakable bond. Gi was his inner skeleton, the moral framework that gave him his upright posture and prevented him from bending to temptation or fear. From gi flowed yu, or heroic courage. This was not the blind recklessness of a man who does not value his life. On the contrary, Bushido taught that to die for a foolish or unworthy cause was a dog's death. True courage was a quality of the spirit, an aspect of gi in action. It was what allowed a samurai to enter the fray of battle with a calm heart, to face mortal danger without losing his composure, and to do what was right in the face of overwhelming opposition. It was, as one text describes it, doing what is right. It was the courage to live when it was right to live, and the courage to die when it was right to die. The third virtue was jin, or benevolence and compassion. The samurai, as the ruling class, possessed immense power of life and death over the common people. This power, Bushido taught, must be tempered with mercy. A warrior who was merely strong and skilled in killing was no more than a brute. Jin was the quality that elevated him. It was the compassion shown to the weak, the mercy extended to a vanquished foe, and the deep affection a lord felt for his subjects. It was the belief that a warrior's strength should be used to protect, not to oppress. This virtue created a necessary balance, preventing the warrior ethos from descending into pure predatory violence. Governing every social interaction was rei, which means respect, politeness, and proper conduct. This was not mere etiquette, it was an expression of a person's regard for the feelings of others. In the highly stratified society of feudal Japan, rei provided a clear set of rules for how to behave, based on one's rank and relationship to others. The precise angle of a bow, the way one entered a room, the language used to address a superior or an inferior, all were expressions of rei. It was a social lubricant that prevented friction and maintained harmony. For the samurai, rei was also a form of training, a way to cultivate self-control and discipline in even the smallest actions of daily life. Hand in hand with rei was makoto, or honesty and sincerity. Bushido held that the spoken word of a samurai was a deed in itself. To give one's word was to commit to a course of action with the full weight of one's honour. There was no need for written contracts or pledges. The simple phrase, bushi no ichigon, or a samurai's single word, was an absolute guarantee. To lie or go back on a promise was to fundamentally betray one's own integrity, to lose face in the most profound way. Makoto meant that a samurai's thoughts, words, and actions should be in perfect alignment. At the very heart of the code was meiyo, or honour. Meiyo was a samurai's sense of personal dignity and worth. It was an acute awareness of his own reputation and the reputation of his family and clan. A samurai's name was not his own. It belonged to his ancestors and his descendants. To bring shame upon that name through cowardice, dishonesty, or dishonourable conduct was a fate worse than death. This intense consciousness of personal honour was the driving force behind many of a samurai's most extreme actions. It was for the sake of meiyo that a samurai would fight to the last man against impossible odds, and it was to restore meiyo that he would perform the ultimate act of seppuku. Finally, there was the virtue that bound all the others together and directed them toward a single purpose, chugi, or loyalty. This was the absolute, unwavering and selfless devotion a samurai owed to his daimyo. This bond was the central pillar of the entire feudal structure. A samurai's life was not his own. It belonged to his master. He was expected to carry out his lord's orders without question, to defend him with his last breath, and even to follow him into death through the practice of junshi, or ritual suicide upon a lord's passing. This loyalty was to supersede all other obligations, including those to family, friends, and even to oneself. Of course, this idealized code often clashed with the brutal realities of human nature, especially during the treacherous Sengoku Jidai. History is filled with instances of samurai betraying their masters for personal gain, of cowardice on the battlefield, and of ruthless cruelty. Bushido was an ideal, a star to navigate by, not always a perfect reflection of reality. Yet its power was immense. It provided a moral framework that shaped the samurai's character, giving him a sense of purpose and a path to what he considered a noble life. It was a demanding, unforgiving code, one that valued honour above life itself, and it explains both the greatest acts of heroism and the most profound tragedies of the samurai story. There is no greater testament to the samurai's preoccupation with honour and control than the ritual of seppuku. Known more colloquially in the West by the cruder term harakiri, which simply means belly cutting, seppuku was a highly formalised and deeply symbolic act of suicide. It was a practice unique to the samurai class, a grim privilege that set them apart. For a samurai, the manner of his death was as important, if not more so, than the manner of his life. Seppuku was the ultimate way to demonstrate his courage, self-control, and the purity of his spirit, even in the face of utter failure or disgrace. The reasons a samurai might choose or be compelled to commit seppuku were varied. It could be a form of capital punishment, a way for a samurai who had committed a serious crime to die an honourable death, sparing his family the disgrace of a common execution. It could be an act of kanshi, a way to protest a foolish or unjust decision by one's lord, using one's own death as the most powerful possible form of remonstrance. It was also a way to avoid capture by the enemy on the battlefield. To be taken prisoner was considered a profound dishonour. Seppuku was a final act of defiance that denied the enemy their prize, and, as we have seen, it could be an act of yunshi, following a deceased lord into the afterlife, a practice that was eventually outlawed by the Tokugawa shogunate due to the great loss of valuable retainers it caused. The ritual itself was a solemn and precise affair. If circumstances allowed, it was performed in a formal setting such as in a temple garden, or within a specially prepared enclosure. The samurai would first take a bath and dress in a simple white kimono, the colour of death and purity in Japanese culture. He would be allowed a final meal, and he would drink a final cup of sake. Then, with great composure, he would write his death poem, or jisei no ku, a short verse, often a haiku, that captured his final thoughts on life and his acceptance of mortality. He would then kneel on a white cloth in the formal seated position, his kimono tucked carefully beneath his knees to prevent him from falling backward in an undignified manner after the cut. Before him, on a lacquered tray, would be placed the instrument of his death, the short wakizashi blade, its handle wrapped in white cloth to provide a secure grip. At this point, his chosen second, or kaishakunin, would take his position. The kaishakunin was typically a trusted friend or a skilled swordsman, and his role was one of mercy and honour. He stood behind the kneeling samurai, his own katana drawn and ready. With immense concentration, the samurai would open the top of his kimono, exposing his abdomen. He would then take up the wakizashi and make the first cut, plunging the blade into the left side of his abdomen and drawing it across to the right. This was an excruciatingly painful act, requiring almost superhuman willpower. The abdomen, or hara, was considered the seat of the emotions and the spirit in Japanese culture. To cut it open was to symbolically display the purity and sincerity of one's soul to the world. If his strength allowed, he might make a second, upward cut. It was at this precise moment, as the samurai completed the cut or just as he began to show the first sign of flinching from the pain, that the kaishakunin had to act. His duty was to perform dakitai, the embracing cut, a single, clean sword stroke that would nearly sever the head of the kneeling samurai, leaving it attached by a small flap of skin at the front of the neck, so that it would fall forward into his lap as if in a final bow. The skill of the kaishakunin was paramount. A single, perfect cut was an act of honour and compassion, ending the samurai's agony. A clumsy, botched cut that required multiple strokes was a source of deep shame for both parties. This grim ritual, so alien to a modern Western sensibility, was the logical endpoint of the Bushido Code. It was the ultimate expression of the belief that honour was more valuable than life. It demonstrated that a true samurai had complete mastery over his own body and his own fear. In an existence defined by violence and uncertainty, seppuku was the one final act over which a samurai could exert absolute control. It was his final, terrible and poignant masterpiece of self-discipline. While the warrior's path was the defining feature of the samurai, his spirit was nourished and tempered by a deep engagement with spirituality and philosophy. The raw martial energy of the samurai was channeled and refined by two powerful belief systems that, in Japan, did not conflict but rather complemented one another: the indigenous faith of Shinto and the imported philosophy of Buddhism. Together, they provided the samurai with a comprehensive framework for understanding the world, his place in it, and the nature of his own mortality. Shinto, the way of the gods, is the ancient native religion of Japan. It has no single founder, no sacred scriptures in the manner of the Bible or the Quran. It is a faith rooted in the land itself, in the animistic belief that divine spirits, or kami, inhabit all things, not just gods and goddesses, but also mountains, rivers, waterfalls, ancient trees, and even uniquely shaped rocks. Shinto is a religion of life, of fertility, and of purity. Its focus is on this world, on celebrating the beauty of nature and maintaining harmony between the human world and the world of the kami. For the samurai, Shintoism provided a deep connection to the soil of Japan and to his own ancestry. Clans traced their lineage back to specific kami, and the emperor himself was believed to be a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. This gave the samurai's duty to his lord and to the emperor a sacred dimension. He was not just defending a political entity. He was defending a divine land, the abode of the gods. Shinto rituals of purification, involving prayers, offerings, and cleansing with water, were an integral part of a samurai's life. Before a battle, he would pray at a Shinto shrine for victory and for the protection of Hachiman, the kami of war and the divine protector of the Minamoto clan and the samurai class as a whole. If Shinto provided a framework for living in this world, Buddhism provided a framework for understanding the nature of suffering, impermanence, and death. Arriving in Japan from Korea and China around the 6th century, Buddhism introduced the concepts of karma, reincarnation, and the path to enlightenment. It taught that life is filled with suffering, or dukkha, which is caused by attachment and desire. By following the Buddhist path, one could extinguish these desires and achieve a state of liberation, or nirvana. In the early Kamakura period, several new schools of Buddhism took root in Japan that had a particular appeal to the samurai. Pure Land Buddhism offered a simple path to salvation, promising that anyone who chanted the name of the Amida Buddha with sincere faith would be reborn in a celestial paradise. This offered great comfort to the common soldier and samurai alike, who faced the constant prospect of a violent death. But it was Zen Buddhism that truly became the religion of the samurai elite. Zen, with its emphasis on self-reliance, rigorous meditation, and the attainment of enlightenment through personal experience rather than reliance on scriptures, was a perfect philosophical match for the warrior's mindset. Zen taught that enlightenment was not something to be found in a distant future or a faraway paradise, but could be realized in the here and now in the midst of everyday activities. It prized discipline, focus, and intuition over intellectualism. For a samurai, whose life often depended on making split-second decisions in the heat of battle, this was a profoundly practical philosophy. The practice of zazen, or seated meditation, was central to Zen training. By sitting for hours in a state of quiet, focused awareness, a samurai could learn to still the chatter of his mind, to observe his thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them. This cultivated a state of mental clarity and unshakable calm, a mind like the surface of a still pond that perfectly reflects the sky. This was the state of Fudoshin, the immovable mind, a mind that could not be disturbed by fear, anger, or doubt, even when facing a drawn sword, Zen masters used various techniques to break their students' reliance on logical thought and force them into a more intuitive state of awareness. One method was the koan, a paradoxical riddle or question that could not be solved with reason, such as, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" By wrestling with a koan, a student would exhaust his rational mind, creating an opening for a sudden flash of intuitive insight, or satori. This training was directly applicable to combat, where a warrior needed to react instantly and without hesitation, his actions flowing naturally from a deep intuitive understanding of the situation. The fusion of Zen and the martial arts was profound. Swordsmanship became not just a technique for killing, but a form of moving meditation, a Zen in motion. The great swordmaster Yagyu Munenori wrote that the ultimate goal of the sword was not to defeat an opponent, but to conquer one's own mind. The concepts of Zen permeated the language of the martial arts. The ideal state was mushin, no mind, where the swordsman acts spontaneously, his body moving without the interference of a conscious, calculating self. He and his sword become one, and the distinction between himself and his opponent dissolves. There is only the pure, present moment of action. These two belief systems, Shinto and Zen Buddhism, coexisted harmoniously within the samurai. He might pray at a Shinto shrine for a successful harvest, and then go to a Zen temple to meditate on the nature of emptiness. Shinto connected him to the sacredness of his land and his ancestors, while Zen gave him the mental and spiritual tools to face the hardships and mortality of his violent profession. This spiritual duality is key to understanding the paradox of the samurai. How a man could be both a deadly warrior and a serene poet, a killer who could arrange flowers with gentle precision, a man of action who sought a state of perfect stillness. It is a testament to the complexity of the samurai ideal that the same warrior who practiced the deadly art of the sword also cultivated the gentle and refined arts of peace. The principle of Bunburyudo, the dual way of the literary and martial arts, dictated that a true samurai must be a man of both action and contemplation, of both strength and sensitivity. To be skilled only in war was to be brutish and incomplete. It was through the practice of the arts that a samurai polished his spirit, cultivated mindfulness, and found a deeper appreciation for the transient beauty of the world. Perhaps no art form is more closely associated with the samurai aesthetic than the composition of poetry. Literacy was highly prized, and from a young age a samurai was expected to study the great poets of China and Japan. He would practice his calligraphy, the way of the brush, or shodo, with the same diligence he applied to his swordsmanship. The control, balance, and decisiveness required to create a beautiful character with a single, uncorrectable brushstroke was seen as a direct reflection of a person's inner state. A man's handwriting was a window into his soul. Samurai composed poetry in various forms, but the short, evocative forms of haiku and tanka were particularly favoured, especially for their connection to Zen principles. Haiku, with its strict structure of 5 to 7 5-syllables, forces the poet to distill a single, fleeting moment into a sharp, clear image. It is an art of suggestion, of what is left unsaid. This resonated with the Zen ideal of direct, intuitive understanding. For the samurai, composing a haiku was an exercise in pure observation, a way of capturing the profound in the ordinary. The sound of a frog jumping into a pond, the sight of a crow on a bare branch, the feeling of the autumn wind. The most poignant expression of this poetic tradition was the Jizei no Ku, the death poem. It was a custom for a samurai, when he knew his death was imminent, whether on the eve of a battle or before committing seppuku, to compose a final verse. This was not a lament or a cry of despair. Rather, it was a calm, often beautiful, and sometimes even ironic reflection on the nature of life and his acceptance of his own end. The great daimyo Ota Dokan, when he was assassinated, wrote, "Had I not known that I was already dead, I would have mourned my loss of life." These poems are a powerful testament to the samurai's stoic composure and his deep engagement with the Buddhist concept of life's impermanence. Another art form deeply patronized and practiced by the samurai elite, particularly during the Ashikaga shogunate, was the No theatre, No is a slow, minimalist, and highly symbolic form of musical drama. Its stories are often drawn from classical literature and myth, dealing with themes of ghosts, gods, and warriors. The actors, clad in magnificent costumes and wearing carved wooden masks, move with a stylized, almost glacial grace. The effect is not one of realistic drama, but of a profound and mysterious ritual. For the samurai audience, watching a No play was a form of meditation, a contemplation of grand, universal themes of honour, duty, loss, and redemption. We have already touched upon the tea ceremony, Shanoyu, but its importance as a peaceful art cannot be overstated. In the humble, rustic simplicity of the tea hut, the samurai found an antidote to the ostentation and violence of his public life. The philosophy of tea, as refined by masters like Senno Rikyu, was based on the principles of harmony, WEA, respect, Kei, purity, Sei, and tranquility, Jaku. Every element of the ceremony, from the boiling of the water to the whisking of the tea to the choice of the utensils, was designed to foster a state of mindful presence. In a world of constant conflict, the tea ceremony was a radical act of peace, a shared moment of profound and simple humanity. This aesthetic of refined simplicity, known as wabi-sabi, found expression in many other areas of samurai life. Wabi-sabi is the appreciation of the imperfect, the impermanent, and the incomplete. It is the beauty of things that are modest, humble, and unconventional. It is the rough texture of a handmade tea bowl, the patina of aged wood, the subtle beauty of a moss-covered stone. This aesthetic stood in stark contrast to the gold and glitter of the imperial court. It was a beauty that was quiet, introspective, and deeply connected to the natural world. This connection to nature was most powerfully expressed in the art of the garden. The samurai patronised and sometimes even designed their own gardens, which were seen as three-dimensional works of art. The dry landscape garden, or kahasan-sui, is the most famous example. Here, in an enclosed space, rocks and raked sand are used to create an abstract representation of a mountain and sea's cape. With no living plants, the garden is a timeless, still-life composition that invites deep meditation on the nature of emptiness and form. To sit and contemplate such a garden was to clear the mind and find a sense of inner peace. These artistic pursuits were not diversions from the way of the warrior. They were an essential part of it. They were disciplines that cultivated the same qualities necessary for a martial artist: focus, patience, self-control, and a deep awareness of the present moment. They provided balance to the samurai's life, nurturing the side of him that could appreciate beauty as keenly as he could deliver a death blow. It was this integration of the arts of war and peace that made the samurai ideal so compelling and so enduring, creating a warrior who sought not just victory on the battlefield, but enlightenment of the spirit. Although the samurai class was officially abolished in the late 19th century, its shadow looms long over the landscape of modern Japan, and its image continues to captivate the imagination of the world. The legacy of the samurai is a complex tapestry, woven from threads of history, myth, and modern interpretation. The warrior himself may have vanished, but the ideals he embodied, both real and imagined, have been repurposed, reinterpreted, and absorbed into the very DNA of Japanese culture and beyond. In the immediate aftermath of the Meiji Restoration, the new government had an ambivalent relationship with its own samurai past. On one hand, they had ruthlessly dismantled the feudal system and the samurai class to modernize the nation. On the other, the leaders of the new Japan were themselves former samurai, and they needed a powerful national ideology to unite the country and motivate its people. They found it by selectively co-opting the old samurai code. They stripped Bushido of its loyalty to a feudal lord and redirected it toward a new, absolute loyalty to the emperor and the state. This new state-sponsored Bushido became a key component of Japanese nationalism and education in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was used to instill a sense of discipline, sacrifice, and martial pride in the new conscript army and in the populace as a whole. The stoic endurance, self-sacrifice, and fanatical loyalty of the idealized samurai were presented as virtues to which all Japanese people should aspire. This reimagined code would be taken to its darkest extremes during the Second World War, used to justify imperial expansion and to inspire soldiers to fight to the last man and to carry out suicide attacks, twisting the original spirit of the warrior into a tool of modern total warfare. After Japan's defeat in 1945, there was a strong reaction against this militaristic interpretation of the samurai legacy. For a time, the warrior spirit was seen as a dangerous and destructive force that had led the nation to ruin. But as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse, the samurai virtues were once again reinterpreted. The focus shifted away from the battlefield and toward the boardroom. The samurai ideals of loyalty, discipline, dedication, and the relentless pursuit of perfection were seen as the driving forces behind Japan's economic miracle. The loyalty a samurai owed his daimyo was compared to the lifelong loyalty a Japanese salaryman was expected to give his company. The intense focus and discipline of a swordsman perfecting his craft were mirrored in the meticulous attention to quality and detail practiced by Japanese engineers and factory workers. The concept of the group taking precedence over the individual, so central to the feudal clan, was seen as the foundation of Japan's successful corporate culture. The samurai, it was argued, had simply traded his sword for a briefcase. In the West, the image of the samurai has been a source of fascination for centuries, evolving from the exotic warrior of early travelogues to a global pop culture icon. It was perhaps the films of the masterful director Akira Kurosawa, such as Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, that did the most to shape the modern international perception of the samurai. Kurosawa presented a complex, humanized vision of the warrior. His samurai were not flawless paragons of virtue, but complex men grappling with honor, duty, and violence in a chaotic world. His films, in turn, heavily influenced Western genres, most notably the Western, with The Magnificent Seven being a direct remake of Seven Samurai. Today, the spirit of the samurai endures in many facets of Japanese life. It is visible in the serene discipline of modern martial arts, or Gendai Budo, like Kendo, Judo, and Aikido, which are practiced by millions around the world not just as forms of self-defense, but as paths to self-improvement. It can be seen in the quiet precision of a master sushi chef, whose focused, economical movements with his knife echo the grace of a swordsman. It persists in the minimalist aesthetics of Japanese design, and in the deep cultural appreciation for craftsmanship and the pursuit of perfection in any chosen endeavour. This samurai left behind more than just magnificent castles and beautiful swords. They left a philosophical and aesthetic legacy that has profoundly shaped the character of their nation. While the reality of their lives was often brutal, violent, and far from the romanticised ideal, the ideal itself remains a powerful force. It is a testament to a culture that sought to find a path of discipline, honour, and beauty in a world of impermanence and conflict. The story of the samurai is, in the end, a timeless human story about the struggle to live and die with purpose and grace. To further illuminate the world the samurai inhabited, we must also consider the rigid social structure they both created and sat atop. The Tokugawa shogunate, in its pursuit of absolute stability, perfected a four-tiered class system known as the Shinokosho. This hierarchy, based on Confucian ideals, was not just a social convention, but a legally enforced reality. At the pinnacle was the Shi, the warrior class encompassing the samurai. They were the rulers and administrators, their right to govern justified by their martial heritage and their role as protectors of the peace. Below them came the No, the farmers and peasants. In the Confucian worldview, they were the second most important class because they produced the food that sustained all of society. Their labour was considered honourable and essential. Despite this high theoretical status, the life of a peasant was one of unrelenting toil and heavy taxation. They were tied to the land, forbidden to leave their villages or change their occupation. They paid their taxes in rice, the very commodity that fueled the entire samurai economy, often turning over more than half of their harvest to the local lord, leaving them with just enough for subsistence. Next on the social ladder were the Ko, the artisans and craftsmen. This class included swordsmiths, potters, weavers, carpenters, and all those who created the goods used by the other classes. They were considered less vital than the farmers because they did not produce food, but their skills were respected, and master craftsmen could achieve a high degree of social standing and wealth. They typically lived in their own designated quarters within towns and cities, their lives governed by the strict rules of their guilds. At the very bottom of the hierarchy were the sho, the merchants. In the Confucian system, merchants were viewed with disdain. They produced nothing themselves, but rather profited from the work of others by buying and selling goods. They were seen as a parasitic and morally suspect class. This official contempt, however, masked a growing reality. As Japan's economy shifted during the long Edo peace, and a vibrant cash-based urban culture emerged, the merchants became increasingly wealthy and powerful. They were the engine of a new consumer-driven society, a fact that created immense tension within the rigid social order. Outside and below this four-tiered system existed a class of outcasts known as the burakumin, or hamlet people. These were people whose occupations were considered unclean in Buddhist or Shinto belief, such as butchers, tanners, executioners and undertakers, professions that dealt with death and animal hides. They were forced to live in their own segregated ghettos and were subject to severe social discrimination. They were, in essence, an untouchable class, a dark underbelly to the meticulously ordered society the samurai presided over. For the samurai, this system was both a source of privilege and a cage. Their superior status was undeniable. They had the right to carry swords, a privilege known as kiriste gomen, which legally permitted a samurai to strike down a commoner who had insulted him or compromised his honour. While this right was exercised very rarely, its existence was a constant and potent reminder of the samurai's power. They lived in their own districts, were subject to their own laws, and were entitled to a respect that bordered on reverence. Yet, this privilege came at a cost. The economic stagnation of the samurai class in the face of rising merchant wealth created a deep and abiding resentment. A samurai might be forced to bow his head and ask for a loan from a merchant he officially despised. This inversion of the theoretical social order, where the lowest class held the economic power, was a source of profound psychological stress and humiliation for many samurai. It was a clear sign that the world they were meant to rule was changing in ways their code could not account for. The system also enforced a rigid conformity. A samurai's life was not his own to choose. His occupation, his place of residence, even his choice of wife, were all dictated by his station and the will of his lord. There was little room for personal ambition or deviation from the norm. This rigid order, designed to ensure peace, also created a society that was, in many ways, static and stifling. The tension between the official, unchanging hierarchy and the dynamic, evolving reality of Edo period society was a central drama of the age, and it was a conflict that would ultimately contribute to the downfall of the entire system. Let us now turn our attention to the great stages upon which the samurai drama unfolded, the castles of Japan. These magnificent structures were far more than just military fortifications. They were the administrative centres of the daimyo's domain, symbols of his power and wealth, and sprawling fortified cities in their own right. The Japanese castle evolved over centuries, reaching its apotheosis during the late Sengoku and early Edo periods, becoming a sophisticated and beautiful expression of both military engineering and political authority. Unlike their European counterparts, which were built almost exclusively of stone, the classic Japanese castle was a combination of three key elements: stone, wood, and earth. The foundation was a massive stone base, known as the ishigaki. These walls were constructed from huge, carefully fitted stones, often assembled without mortar. The elegant curves of these walls were not just for aesthetic effect, they were an ingenious defensive feature, making them incredibly stable and resistant to the earthquakes that frequently shake the Japanese islands. Atop these stone ramparts rose the castle's distinctive wooden structures, with their multiple tiers of gracefully curving tile roofs and white plastered walls. The plaster was not merely decorative, it was a thick, fire-resistant coating that helped protect the wooden timbers from flaming arrows and the new threat of cannonballs. The most prominent structure was the main keep, or Tenshukaku, a multi-storied tower that served as the castle's final defensive bastion, a command centre, and a towering symbol of the lord's prestige. From the top floor of the Tenshukaku, the daimyo could survey his entire domain. The layout of the castle was a masterclass in psychological warfare and defensive strategy. The approach to the main keep was never direct. It was a deliberately confusing maze of winding paths, blind corners, and massive, heavily fortified gatehouses. An attacking army would be forced to navigate this labyrinth, making sharp turns that would break their momentum and expose their flanks to archers and musketeers, firing from loopholes and towers along the walls. Gates were often staggered, so that even if an outer gate was breached, the attackers would find themselves trapped in a narrow enclosed courtyard, a killing box, where they could be annihilated by defenders firing from the surrounding walls. The castle's defences were layered in a series of concentric baileys, or maru. The innermost bailey, the Honmaru, contained the main keep and the lord's private residence. Surrounding this were the second and third baileys, which housed barracks, storehouses, and the residences of important retainers. Each bailey was separated from the next by massive walls and deep, dry moats. To take the castle, an army would have to fight its way through each of these layers, a bloody and time-consuming process that would deplete their strength and morale. Within the keep itself, the defences continued. The staircases were steep and narrow, making it difficult for attackers in armour to ascend quickly. The floors were filled with hidden features, such as warrior hiding closets, where defenders could lie in ambush, Anishiotoshi, or stone-dropping windows, which were chutes built into the walls that allowed defenders to drop rocks or pour boiling water on enemies attempting to scale the stone base below. The entire structure was designed to be a vertical battleground, a death trap for any who dared to enter. During the long peace of the Edo period, the castle's role shifted from a purely military one to that of a political and administrative centre. While their defensive features remained, they also became more palatial. The inner residences were decorated with magnificent painted screens, intricate wood carvings, and gilded ceilings. The castle town, or Jokamachi, that grew up around its base became the economic and cultural heart of the domain. Samurai lived in their designated quarters, artisans and merchants in theirs, all within the protective shadow of their lord's fortress. Many of these magnificent structures were destroyed over the centuries through warfare, fires, or deliberate dismantling by the Meiji government, which saw them as symbols of the feudal past. But a handful of original castles like the stunning Himeji-jo, the White Heron Castle, survive to this day. To walk their grounds is to step back in time. It is to trace the winding paths designed to foil an enemy, to look up at the towering keep that projected absolute authority, and to feel, in the silent stones and weathered timbers, the immense power and enduring legacy of the samurai lords who built them. While the samurai class itself was exclusively male, to ignore the role of women is to see only half of the picture. The women of the samurai class, the wives, mothers and daughters, lived lives that were just as circumscribed by the code of honour and duty. They were the silent partners in the samurai enterprise, the keepers of the household, and the anchors of the family line. Their world was largely a domestic one, but it was a world that required immense strength, discipline, and, at times, a warrior's courage. The ideal samurai woman was embodied by the concept of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. Although this term was popularized in the Meiji period, the ideal it represents has much older roots. Her primary duties were to her husband, her children, and her husband's family. She was expected to be skilled in domestic arts, to manage the household finances with frugality and skill, and to oversee the servants. In a world where her husband could be called away to war or to serve his lord in a distant province for years at a time, the wife became the de facto ruler of the household domain. Her education reflected these responsibilities. While she was not typically taught the Chinese classics to the same extent as her brothers, she was expected to be literate, able to read and write in the Japanese script. She was schooled in etiquette, music, and the arts of the tea ceremony and flower arranging, all of which were considered essential for a woman of her standing. But her education was not purely aesthetic. She was also instilled with the same martial values as the men: loyalty, endurance, and a stoic acceptance of fate. As mentioned, many samurai women were trained in the martial arts. The naginata was their primary weapon, a versatile polearm that was well suited for defending a home. In the annals of Japanese history, there are tales of remarkable female warriors, the Onabugeisha, who fought on the battlefield alongside men. One of the most famous was Tomoe Gozen, a warrior of the Genpei War described in the Tale of the Heike as a formidable archer and swordswoman, a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god. While figures like Tomoe Gozen were the exception rather than the rule, their stories demonstrate that the martial spirit was not exclusively a male preserve. A more common, and perhaps more harrowing expectation for a samurai woman was her duty in the face of defeat. If her family's castle was about to fall, she was expected not to submit to the dishonour of capture. Like the men, she was prepared to die. Women of the samurai class were taught the art of ritual suicide known as jigai. Instead of the abdominal cut of seppuku, the method for women was to use a small dagger, or kaiken, which they often carried concealed in their sleeves, to cut the jugular vein in the neck. Before doing so, they would often tie their legs together with a cord to ensure a modest and dignified posture in death. It was a grim testament to the fact that the demands of honour applied equally to both genders. The life of a samurai wife was one of profound sacrifice and restraint. Her marriage was a political arrangement, her personal feelings secondary to the needs of her family. Her identity was subsumed into that of her husband's household. Yet, within this restrictive framework, many women wielded considerable influence. They were the primary educators of their children, instilling in them the values and discipline expected of the samurai class. They were shrewd managers whose skillful stewardship could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin for their families. They were the silent, uncelebrated pillars that supported the entire edifice of samurai society. Their story is one of quiet strength, a testament to the resilience and endurance that lay at the heart of the warrior's world. The world of the samurai, particularly during the Great Peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, was a meticulously constructed edifice of control. To ensure that the fires of the Sengoku Jidai were never rekindled, the shoguns in Edo devised a system of political mastery that was both ingenious and cripplingly expensive for those it sought to control. The centerpiece of this system was known as Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance. It was a policy that, on the surface, seemed like a simple requirement for the daimyo to pay their respects to the shogun, but in reality, it was a golden cage, a brilliant mechanism for ensuring loyalty by turning every provincial lord into a potential hostage. The rules were deceptively straightforward. Every daimyo was required to divide his time between his own domain and the shogun's capital city of Edo. Typically, a lord would spend 1 year in Edo and the next in his home province. But the true genius of the system lay in a crucial detail. While the daimyo was in his domain, his wife and heir were required to remain in Edo, living in a lavish mansion that the daimyo himself was forced to build and maintain. They were, in effect, high-status hostages, ensuring the lord's good behaviour. Any hint of rebellion would mean the immediate death of his family. It was a powerful and unspoken threat that kept even the most powerful and distant lords in a state of perpetual check. This system had profound and far-reaching consequences that reshaped the entire landscape of Japan. The financial burden on the daimyo was immense. They had to maintain 2 magnificent residences, one in their domain and one in Edo. Furthermore, their journey to and from the capital had to be a grand procession, a public display of their status and wealth. A powerful lord would travel with a retinue of hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of samurai retainers, servants, and porters. The cost of food, lodging, and equipment for these journeys, which could take weeks or even months, was staggering, and was deliberately designed to drain the treasuries of the daimyo, preventing them from accumulating the wealth needed to raise an army and challenge the shogun. These vast semi-annual migrations turned the major highways of Japan, especially the Great Tokaido Road that linked Kyoto and Edo, into bustling arteries of commerce and culture. A network of post stations, inns and tea houses sprang up to service the endless processions of daimyo and their retainers. This constant movement of people and goods stimulated the economy, fostered a sense of a unified national culture, and transformed Edo from a provincial town into one of the largest and most vibrant cities in the world. the samurai of the provinces were exposed to the latest trends in fashion, theatre and art from the capital, which they would then take back to their domains. In this way, a policy designed for political control inadvertently became a powerful engine of cultural integration. While the sword remained the samurai's most iconic symbol, the reality of the battlefield, especially during the Sengoku period, was often dominated by a different weapon, the spear or yari. The yari was the true king of the massed infantry battle. Ranging in length from a few feet to over 20, it was a versatile and deadly weapon. In the hands of a disciplined unit of Ashigaru foot soldiers, a dense hedge of spear points could stop a cavalry charge in its tracks. For a samurai on foot, the spear's reach provided a crucial advantage over a swordsman. The art of the spear, also jutsu, was a core component of any warrior's training, requiring not just strength, but immense skill in footwork, timing and leverage. The battlefield was not a series of noble duels, but a chaotic, brutal press of bodies, and in that environment, the long reach of the yari was often more decisive than the fine edge of the katana. As the Edo period enforced a peace that made battlefield weapons less practical for daily life, the focus of martial arts shifted towards self-defense in civilian contexts. This gave rise to the refinement and proliferation of unarmed combat systems, known collectively as jujutsu. These were the arts of the gentle technique, based on the principle of using an attacker's own strength and momentum against them. Jujutsu encompassed a wide range of techniques: throws, joint locks, chokes, and strikes to vital points. It was a practical skill for a samurai who might find himself in a confrontation inside a building, or in a situation where drawing his sword was either illegal or unwise. From these ancient samurai arts of jujutsu would eventually evolve many of the modern martial arts we know today, including judo and aikido, their lethal purpose transformed into a path of physical and moral development. Lurking in the shadows of the samurai's world of honor-bound open combat was another kind of warrior, one whose very existence was a contradiction to the Bushido code. These were the shinobi, or as they are more famously known in the West, the ninja. They were not a separate class, but rather specialists in espionage, sabotage, assassination and guerrilla warfare. Often recruited from the lower ranks of samurai or the common people, in specific regions like Iga and Koga, the shinobi were masters of unconventional tactics. Their arts, known as ninjutsu, focused on stealth, deception, and infiltration, methods that a conventional samurai would view as disgraceful and cowardly. The samurai's code demanded that he announce his name before a duel, that he fight his enemy face to face with courage and honor. The shinobi, in contrast, worked in the dead of night. They used disguises, climbing tools, explosives, poisons, and a variety of trick weapons. Their goal was not to win an honorable victory, but to achieve a strategic objective with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. They were the spies who gathered intelligence from inside an enemy's castle, the saboteurs who set fire to supply depots, and the assassins who crept into a general's tent to eliminate him in his sleep. Despite their official disdain for such underhanded methods, the daimyo of the Sengoku period recognized the immense value of the shinobi and employed them frequently. They were a necessary evil, a secret weapon in the ruthless calculus of war. A samurai lord would never openly admit to using ninja, but their hand can be seen in the sudden, mysterious deaths of commanders and the inexplicable failures of seemingly secure fortresses. The shinobi were the dark reflection of the samurai ideal, a reminder that in the brutal struggle for power, the pristine rules of honor were often the first casualty. They were the ghosts in the machinery of feudal warfare, their true history forever obscured by the myths and legends they so expertly cultivated. To understand the moment when the Age of Chaos ended and the long Tokugawa peace began, we must travel back to the dawn of a single fateful day, October 21st, 1600. The place is a narrow valley in central Japan, a place whose name means the field of the barrier, Sekigahara. Here, the future of Japan would be decided in the largest and most decisive samurai battle in its history. On one side was the Western Army, a coalition of powerful daimyo loyal to the memory of the great unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and his young heir, led by the brilliant but somewhat uncharismatic administrator, Ishida Mitsunari. On the other side was the Eastern Army, commanded by the most patient, cunning, and powerful daimyo in the land, the old fox Tokugawa Ieyasu. The morning broke under a thick clinging fog, shrouding the valley in an eerie silence. More than 160,000 warriors were assembled, a sea of banners, spears, and polished armour, yet they could barely see one another. Ieyasu's eastern army was outnumbered, but he held a crucial advantage that was invisible to his opponent. He had spent months engaged in secret correspondence, securing promises of betrayal from several of the key commanders in the western ranks. The battle, when it finally began, was a furious swirling melee. The western forces, taking advantage of their superior positions, initially pushed the eastern army back. The fighting was desperate, a cacophony of musket fire, war cries, and the brutal clang of steel on steel. As the hours wore on, Ishida Mitsunari repeatedly sent signals to his allies positioned on the hillsides to sweep down and crush Ieyasu's flank, but the signals went unanswered. The lords he was counting on, most notably Kobayakawa Hideaki, who commanded a massive force of 15,000 men on Mount Matsuo, remained motionless, watching the battle unfold below, waiting to see which way the tide would turn. The fate of Japan hung in the balance, resting on the indecision of a single man. Ieyasu, growing impatient, forced the issue. He ordered his musketeers to fire directly into Kobayakawa's position on the hill, not as an attack, but as a violent public demand for an answer. The message was brutally clear: choose a side or be destroyed. The gamble paid off. Spurred into action, Kobayakawa Hideaki ordered his entire army to charge, not against Ieyasu, but down the hill and straight into the flank of his own allies in the Western Army. The betrayal was sudden and catastrophic. The sight of Kobayakawa's banners plunging into their side sent a wave of panic and confusion through the Western ranks. Other lords who had made secret pacts with Ieyasu saw their moment and switched sides as well. The Western Army, so dominant just moments before, dissolved into a state of total collapse. By mid-afternoon, the battle had become a rout, a bloody hunt for the fleeing remnants of the Western forces. Ishida Mitsunari escaped the battlefield, but was captured days later and executed in Kyoto. In a single day of fog, fighting and treachery, Tokugawa Ieyasu had eliminated all opposition and secured his position as the undisputed master of Japan. The Battle of Sekigahara was the final violent punctuation mark at the end of the Sengoku Jidai. It was the birth pang of a new era of peace, a peace that would be built upon the foundation of Ieyasu's absolute power and that would last for over 250 years. The life of a samurai was not always confined to the castle town or the battlefield. Travel was a frequent necessity, whether for military campaigns, official business, or the great Sankin-Kotai processions. To facilitate this movement, Japan was crisscrossed by a network of well-maintained highways, the most important of which were the five routes, or Gokaido, which all converged on Edo. The most famous of these was the Tokaido, the Eastern Sea Road, which stretched for some 300 miles along the Pacific coast, connecting the new shogunal capital of Edo with the old imperial capital of Kyoto. To travel this road was to experience a cross-section of all of Japanese society. A samurai on official business, his two swords a clear sign of his status, would travel with a retinue appropriate to his rank. He might ride a horse, but more often than not, long distances were covered on foot. The most important lords travelled in magnificent palanquins, or cargo, enclosed litters carried on the shoulders of teams of porters, their procession a slow, stately river of humanity flowing along the highway. At intervals along the road were 53 post stations, small towns that existed solely to serve travellers. Here one could find inns, hatago for lodging, stables for fresh horses, and legions of porters and messengers. Travel, however, was not free and unrestricted. The shogunate maintained a series of heavily guarded checkpoints, or sekisho, at strategic points along all major roads. The official purpose of these barriers was to keep guns from entering Edo and women from leaving it. The first part was to prevent weapons from being smuggled into the capital for a potential uprising. The second was to enforce the Sankin-Kotai system, ensuring that the wives of the daimyo, who were effectively hostages, did not try to escape back to their home provinces. Every traveller had their documents and baggage meticulously inspected. For a samurai, passing through these checkpoints was a formality, but for a commoner, it could be a nerve-wracking ordeal. This world of the road, with its varied landscapes, bustling, post towns and colourful cast of characters, pilgrims, merchants, itinerant monks and stoic samurai, captured the imagination of the Edo period populace. It was immortalised in the famous woodblock prints of artists like Hiroshige, whose series The 53 Stations of the Tokaido became a cultural sensation. For the samurai, the road was a place of transition, a space between the rigid structure of his duties in Edo and the familiar hierarchies of his home domain. It was a microcosm of the peaceful, ordered and highly controlled world that their ancestors had fought and died to create. Within this highly structured and controlled society, where every action was dictated by duty and social expectation, there was a deep and often unspoken tension between Giri and Ninjo. Giri can be translated as duty, social obligation, or the debt of gratitude one owes to one's lord, family and society. It was the external, rational code of conduct that a samurai was expected to follow without question. Ninjo, on the other hand, was human feeling, the messy, unpredictable and deeply personal world of love, passion, jealousy, and sorrow. The central tragic theme of much of Japanese literature and drama from this period is the conflict that arises when a samurai's personal feelings clash with his rigid social duties. To escape the immense pressures of the giri-bound world, many samurai, along with the newly wealthy merchants, sought refuge in the entertainment districts that flourished in major cities like Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka. This was the ukiyo, or the floating world. The term, originally a Buddhist one referring to the transient and sorrowful world of mortal existence, was playfully reappropriated to describe a world of fleeting, ephemeral pleasures. The floating world was the realm of the kabuki theatre, the sumo wrestling arena, the tea houses, and most famously the licensed pleasure quarters. Here, in vibrant districts like Edo's Yoshiwara, a different social order prevailed. A samurai was expected to leave his swords, and with them his rank and status at the entrance. Inside, a man's worth was measured not by his birth, but by the weight of his purse and the sophistication of his taste. It was a world of sensual indulgence, of art, music, and fashion, presided over by the great courtesans. These were not common prostitutes. The highest-ranking courtesans, or wuran, were highly accomplished women, skilled in conversation, poetry, music, and the tea ceremony. To win their favour required not just immense wealth, but also wit, charm, and an appreciation for the arts. The floating world was a necessary escape valve for the rigid, honour-bound society of the samurai. It was a place where the suffocating demands of duty could be temporarily set aside, and where human feeling, ninjo, could be expressed more freely. Yet, it was a fraught and often tragic world. Many a samurai ruined his family's finances and reputation through an obsession with a courtesan. The stories of the floating world, often depicting the impossible love between a samurai and a courtesan, a love doomed by the unbridgeable gap between their social worlds, were immensely popular, reflecting the deep cultural fascination with the eternal conflict between duty and desire. The samurai's world was not only populated by lords, peasants and merchants, it was also teeming with beings from another unseen realm. Japanese folklore is rich with a vast and colourful pantheon of supernatural creatures, ghosts and demons, and these beliefs were woven into the very fabric of daily life. This was not a world that had been sanitised by science. It was a world where the veil between the natural and the supernatural was thin and permeable, and a samurai had to be prepared to face threats that were not of this earth. Belief in ghosts, or yurei, was particularly pervasive. It was believed that a person who died a violent or tragic death, or who harboured a powerful emotion like jealousy, or a desire for revenge, would not be able to pass peacefully into the afterlife. Their spirit would remain in the world of the living as a ghost, bound by its unresolved passion. These were often vengeful spirits, or onryo, who would haunt the living, seeking to inflict upon them the suffering they had endured. The story of the Bancho Sarayashiki, about the ghost of a servant girl named Okiku who was executed and thrown down a well, endlessly counting to 9 and then letting out a blood-curdling shriek, was a famous tale that sent shivers down the spine of many a samurai. Beyond ghosts there were the oni, fierce demons or ogres, often depicted with red or blue skin, horns and carrying massive iron clubs. They were figures of immense strength and malevolence, believed to inhabit remote mountains or the Buddhist hells. There were also the tengu, mountain goblins with long noses or beaks, who were said to be masterful swordsmen and mischievous tricksters, sometimes abducting humans or leading them astray in the forest. And then there were the countless varieties of yokai, a broad category of monsters, spirits and goblins, from the water-dwelling kappa who would try to drown unwary travellers, to the shape-shifting fox spirits, or kitsune, who loved to trick and bewitch humans. These beliefs were not mere children's stories. They had a real impact on a samurai's worldview. They reinforced the Buddhist concept of karma, as a life of cruelty could lead to one being tormented by the ghosts of one's victims. They provided a way of explaining misfortune and the unexplainable. A sudden illness might be the work of a curse. A strange noise in the night might be a mischievous yokai. This supernatural landscape found its most powerful expression in the arts. No plays frequently featured ghost stories. An artist like Hokusai and Yoshitoshi created stunning and terrifying woodblock prints depicting famous scenes from folklore and legend. For the samurai, the world was a place of both earthly and spiritual dangers, and his courage had to be sufficient to face them all. The journey to becoming a samurai began at birth. A child born into a samurai family was born into a world of immense expectation and unrelenting pressure. From his earliest moments, he was not treated as a mere child, but as a future warrior in training. His education was a carefully orchestrated process designed to forge him into a worthy successor to his family's name, to instill in him the discipline, courage and skills required by his station. There was little room for the carefree indulgence of modern childhood. His life was a path of duty from the very start. A young samurai boy's training began with the cultivation of stoicism. He was taught to endure pain, cold, and hunger without complaint. He might be forced to go barefoot in the snow, to rise before dawn for training, or to visit execution grounds at night to overcome his fear of death. The goal was to harden both body and spirit, to create a warrior who was unflappable in the face of any adversity. His games were often martial in nature, play-fighting with wooden swords and reenacting the great battles of history. A pivotal moment in a young boy's life was the ceremony of Mamori Gatana, where he was given his first sword. Not a real blade, but a small ornamental dagger in a brocade bag, which he was to wear in his sash at all times. It was a symbolic introduction to the tools of his class and the responsibilities that came with them. His formal education began around the age of 5 or 6. He would spend long hours with a tutor, learning to read and write, practicing calligraphy, and memorizing the Confucian classics, which were the foundation of his moral education. The physical training was equally, if not more, rigorous. He would begin learning the basics of swordsmanship, archery and jujutsu, his every movement corrected and perfected by his teachers. This was a process of endless repetition, designed to build muscle memory until the techniques became a natural instinctive part of him. By his early teens, he was expected to be proficient in the major martial arts and to have a solid grounding in literature and history. The culmination of this period of training was the Genpuku ceremony, a coming-of-age ritual that took place when a boy was between the ages of 13 and 16. During this ceremony, he would shed his child's name and be given a new adult name. His boyish hairstyle would be shaved into the traditional samurai top knot, the shonmeige, and most importantly he would be presented with his first real daisho, his first katana and wakizashi. This moment marked his official entry into the samurai class. He was now considered a man, with all the duties and responsibilities that entailed. He was now ready to take his place in his lord's service, to go to war, and, if necessary, to die for his honour. The path was long and arduous, a testament to the belief that a samurai was not born but forged. The aesthetic sensibilities that governed the samurai's life extended even to his clothing. A samurai's attire was a carefully calibrated statement of his rank, his taste, and the occasion. It was guided by principles of simplicity, functionality, and a deep appreciation for the subtle beauty of texture and colour. While the magnificent suit of armour was his uniform for war, his daily dress was a world of silk, linen and cotton, each garment layered with precision and meaning. The fundamental garment for all classes and genders was the kimono, a T-shaped robe wrapped around the body, always left over right. Right over left was reserved for dressing the dead for burial and secured with a sash, or obi. For a samurai, the kimono worn in daily life was typically made of subdued colours, shades of blue, brown, grey, or black. Flashy colours and ostentatious patterns were considered unseemly and were associated with the lower merchant class or the world of the theatre. The beauty was in the quality of the fabric and the precision of the cut. Beneath the kimono he wore a loincloth, or fundoshi. Over the kimono he would wear the most distinctive part of his formal attire, the kamishimo. This was a two-piece outfit made of starched linen or silk, usually in the same colour as the kimono. The top piece was the kataginu, a sleeveless jacket with large wing-like projecting shoulders. The bottom piece was the hakama, wide, pleated trousers that fell to the ankles. The kamishimo, with its stiff, angular lines, created a powerful and imposing silhouette, and it was the standard formal wear for a samurai on official duty or when attending his lord's court. Footwear consisted of tabi, split-toed socks, and either zori, flat sandals made of rice straw, or gaita, raised wooden clogs that kept the hem of the kimono from dragging in the mud. In cold or rainy weather, a samurai would wear a haori, a hip or thigh-length coat over his kimono. Each element of his dress was a signifier. The material of his kimono, the style of his obi knot, and most importantly the presence of his family crest, or mon, printed in several places on his formal wear, all communicated his identity and social standing at a glance. The meticulous attention to detail extended to personal grooming. A samurai was expected to be immaculately clean. Bathing, either in a private bath at home or in a public bathhouse, was a daily ritual. His hair, the source of his top knot, was his pride. It was washed, oiled, and carefully arranged every day. To appear in public with a dishevelled top knot was a sign of slovenliness and a lack of discipline. This focus on a clean, ordered, and sober appearance was another outward manifestation of the inner discipline that the samurai code demanded. It was a visual expression of the belief that a man's character was revealed in every aspect of his life, down to the very threads he wore. The economic reality of the samurai during the Tokugawa peace was a story of deepening paradox. While they sat at the apex of the social pyramid, their economic foundation was slowly crumbling beneath them. Their wealth was land-based and measured in rice, an agrarian system that was increasingly out of step with the burgeoning commercial economy of the cities. This led to a strange and often humiliating disconnect between their high social status and their often precarious financial situation. A samurai's income, his rice stipend, was fixed and hereditary. The amount he received was based on the rank his ancestors had held centuries before. This created a vast and rigid hierarchy of wealth within the samurai class itself. At the top were the daimyo and their high-ranking retainers, who controlled vast tracts of land and lived in luxury. But the vast majority of samurai were at the lower end of the scale, receiving meagre stipends that were barely enough to support their families in the manner expected of their class. They were the samurai equivalent of the working poor, trapped by their noble status. The problem was exacerbated by the rising cost of living. To maintain their status, a samurai family was expected to live in a certain style of house, wear certain types of clothing, and perform certain rituals, all of which were expensive. The demands of Sankin Kotai also trickled down, as lower-ranking samurai had to pay their own way to accompany their lord to Edo, a journey that could easily consume their entire annual income. To make matters worse, as the merchants grew richer, they drove up the price of goods and services, while the value of the samurai's fixed rice income often declined due to fluctuations in the market price. This forced many samurai into a state of perpetual debt. Their creditors were often the very rice brokers and merchants whom they officially looked down upon. This created a deeply embarrassing power dynamic, where a proud warrior might have to humble himself before a tradesman to secure a loan. To supplement their income, many lower-ranking samurai were forced to engage in work that was considered beneath their station. They might make umbrellas or paper lanterns at home, raise fish in their garden ponds, or even open small schools to teach reading and writing. This side work was a necessary but often shameful secret. The shogunate occasionally issued edicts aimed at curbing merchant wealth and forgiving samurai debts, but these were temporary fixes that failed to address the systemic problem. The economic system that the samurai had created was slowly making them obsolete. This growing poverty and sense of disenfranchisement among the lower samurai was a major source of instability. It was from the ranks of these poor, ambitious, and often resentful lower samurai, particularly from the outer domains, that the leaders of the Meiji Restoration would emerge. Their revolution was fueled not just by nationalist ideology, but also by a deep-seated frustration with a feudal system that had honoured them in name but impoverished them in practice. In a life defined by the ever-present possibility of violent injury, the samurai's relationship with medicine was intimate and pragmatic. The field of medicine during feudal Japan was a complex blend of traditional herbalism, spiritual healing practices rooted in Shinto and Buddhism, and a sophisticated system of medical theory imported from China. For the samurai, medical knowledge was not just for healers, it was a part of the warrior's own skill set, a necessary art for preserving his life and the lives of the men under his command. On the battlefield, there were no sterile operating theatres or miracle anaesthetics. Medicine was a brutal and immediate craft. Wounds from arrows and swords were the most common injuries. An arrowhead lodged in the body was a particularly vexing problem. Field surgeons, who were often samurai themselves with specialised knowledge, would use various instruments to extract them. If the head was barbed, they might have to push it all the way through the other side of a limb to remove it. Wounds were washed, often with the samurai's own urine in the absence of clean water, as it was sterile and believed to have antiseptic properties. They were then packed with cauterizing powders made from ash or herbs to stop the bleeding and stitched shut with fine silk thread. Pain was to be endured with stoic silence, a testament to a warrior's discipline. For broken bones, bamboo splints were used to set the limb. Amputations were a last resort, a grim and often fatal procedure performed with a saw and a searing hot iron to cauterize the stump. The greatest danger, however, often came after the initial injury. In a world without an understanding of germ theory, infection was the silent killer that claimed far more lives than the initial wound. Poultices made from medicinal plants like mugwort, which has antibacterial properties, were applied to wounds in an effort to stave off infection, but their effectiveness was a matter of both luck and the warrior's own constitution. Away from the battlefield, the samurai relied on a more holistic approach to health. The principles of Chinese medicine, which viewed the body as a microcosm of the universe, governed by the flow of a vital energy called qi, and the balance of the opposing forces of yin and yang, were highly influential. Illness was seen as a disruption of this balance. A doctor would diagnose a patient by carefully observing their complexion, listening to their voice, and most importantly by taking their pulse, a complex art that involved reading multiple distinct pulses in each wrist to determine the state of the internal organs. Treatments were designed to restore harmony. Acupuncture, the insertion of fine needles at specific points on the body to unblock the flow of qi, was a common practice. So too was moxibustion, in which small cones of dried mugwort were placed on acupuncture points and burned, creating a therapeutic heat that was believed to stimulate the body's energy. But the most common form of treatment was herbal medicine. The pharmacopoeia was vast, with hundreds of different plants, minerals, and animal parts used in complex prescriptions. A samurai suffering from fatigue might be prescribed ginseng, while a warrior with digestive issues might receive a tonic made from ginger and licorice root. This knowledge was highly valued, and many samurai families kept their own private recipe books of remedies, passed down through the generations. Health, like combat, was a matter of balance, discipline, and a deep, albeit pre-scientific understanding of the forces that governed the body. In the ordered world of the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai's role as a warrior was superseded by his role as a lawgiver and judge. With peace established, the focus of governance shifted from military conquest to civil administration, and at the heart of this was the intricate system of Japanese feudal law. The law was not a single, unified code, but a complex patchwork of shogunal decrees, domain-specific regulations, and deeply ingrained customs. For the samurai magistrate, justice was not an abstract concept to be found in a book. It was a practical art, a balancing act between written law, social hierarchy, and the preservation of public order. The legal system was profoundly hierarchical. The law did not apply equally to all. A crime committed by a commoner against a samurai was treated with far greater severity than the same crime committed against another commoner. The samurai class in many respects stood above the law that governed the lower orders. As we have seen, the right of kurisuta gomen was the ultimate expression of this legal privilege. However, the samurai were subject to their own, often much stricter, set of laws and codes of conduct. For a samurai, a breach of etiquette or a failure of duty could be a capital offence, while a peasant might receive a lesser punishment for a similar transgression. When a crime occurred, it was the duty of the local samurai officials to investigate. This process relied heavily on a network of informers and on the gonin gumi, or 5 family groups. These were mandatory neighbourhood associations in which 5 households were held, collectively responsible for the conduct of all their members. If a person within the group committed a crime, the other 4 families could be punished as well. This system of collective responsibility was a powerful tool for social control, effectively turning every neighbour into a potential police officer and discouraging dissent or criminal activity. When a suspect was apprehended, the trial was not an adversarial process between a prosecutor and a defence attorney, but an inquisitorial one. A samurai magistrate sitting in his hall of judgment, or shirasu, would preside over the case. His goal was to extract a confession, which was considered the highest form of evidence, the queen of proofs. Without a confession, a conviction for a serious crime was difficult to secure. This intense focus on confession led to the widespread and legally sanctioned use of torture. The methods of judicial torture were systematic and brutal. They included flogging with bamboo whips, crushing the legs with heavy stones, and a method known as the shrimp, where the accused was bound with ropes and suspended in a painful contorted position. These methods were not designed to be fatal, but to inflict the maximum amount of pain to force a confession. To the modern mind, this seems barbaric, but in the context of the time, it was seen as a necessary tool to confirm guilt and ensure that justice was served. A suspect who endured all prescribed levels of torture without confessing was often presumed innocent and released. Punishments were equally severe and were designed to serve as a powerful public deterrent. For minor offences, a commoner might be flogged, fined, or have his face tattooed to mark him as a criminal for life. For more serious crimes like arson, robbery or murder, the penalty was death. The methods of execution were varied, and often theatrical in their cruelty. The most common was simple decapitation by a swordsman. Crucifixion was reserved for the most heinous crimes, the condemned left to die slowly over several days as a public spectacle. Burning at the stake was the punishment for arson, a crime that was particularly feared in cities built of wood and paper. For the samurai, the only honourable form of execution was seppuku. To be subjected to the punishments of a commoner was the ultimate disgrace. Justice in the samurai's world was swift, harsh, and an unambiguous expression of the state's absolute power. While the daily diet of the average samurai was a model of austere simplicity, special occasions and the tables of the high-ranking daimyo were a different matter entirely. Here, Japanese cuisine was elevated to a high art form, a multi-course banquet known as honzen ryori. This was a highly formalized and ritualistic style of dining, designed to delight the senses and display the host's wealth and sophistication. A grand feast was a symphony of flavors, colors, and textures, each element carefully chosen and arranged according to a strict culinary and aesthetic grammar. A formal banquet would begin with the ceremonial drinking of sake. The rice wine, served warm in tiny delicate cups, was a symbol of purification and conviviality. A series of 3 cups would be exchanged between host and guest in a ritual known as sansankudo, a tradition that still survives today in Japanese weddings. Following the sake, the food would be brought out on a series of low individual lacquered trays, each holding a specific combination of dishes. The main tray, the honzen, would feature a bowl of rice, a bowl of soup, and a dish of pickles, alongside a main dish of grilled or stewed fish. Subsequent trays would be brought out, each containing a variety of small, exquisite dishes. There might be a plate of sashimi, masterfully sliced raw fish, its freshness a testament to the host's resources. There could be a simmered dish, nemono, of seasonal vegetables and tofu in a delicate dashi broth. There might be a tempura course, with lightly battered and fried seafood and vegetables, a technique that was actually introduced to Japan by the Portuguese in the 16th century. Each dish was a celebration of seasonal ingredients at the peak of their flavour. The arrangement of the food was as important as its taste, with each plate composed like a miniature landscape painting. Sake was the constant companion to the meal. The culture of sake was rich and complex. There were hundreds of regional varieties, each with its own character, from dry and crisp to sweet and full-bodied. For the samurai, drinking was one of the few acceptable forms of social indulgence. A sake party could be a boisterous affair, a chance to relax the rigid formality of daily life, to compose poetry, to boast of martial exploits, and to forge the bonds of camaraderie that were essential in a warrior society. However, even here, discipline was key. To lose one's composure completely through drunkenness was a sign of weakness and a breach of etiquette. The ideal was to enjoy the warmth and fellowship of the drink while maintaining one's self-control. The world of samurai relationships, beyond the pragmatic confines of the arranged marriage, was a complex and often hidden landscape of human emotion. While the bond between husband and wife was one of duty and procreation, the samurai sought other forms of companionship and intimacy. For those who could afford it, the taking of one or more concubines was a common practice. A concubine was officially part of the household, and her children, while of a lower status than those of the official wife, could be named as heirs if the wife failed to produce a son. This created a delicate and often tense dynamic within the household, a world of female hierarchies and subtle rivalries presided over by the official wife. Perhaps one of the most misunderstood and fascinating aspects of samurai sexuality was the tradition of shudo, the way of the young man. This was an institutionalized form of mentorship and love between an older, more experienced samurai and a younger adolescent warrior, or wakashu, who was still in his training. This was not seen as a contradiction to their martial identity, but rather as an integral part of it. The relationship was idealized as a way to instill the virtues of loyalty, discipline, and honor in the younger man. The older partner, the ninja, was expected to be a role model, guiding his young charge in both the martial and the literary arts. The younger partner, in turn, was expected to offer his loyalty and devotion. This bond was considered to be deeply ennobling, a pure form of love untainted by the political or financial considerations that governed heterosexual marriage. It was celebrated in literature and art as the highest form of loyalty and devotion. The ideal relationship was one of a mutual respect and benefit, aimed at forging the younger boy into a perfect samurai. It was expected that when the boy came of age, he would leave the relationship, marry a woman, and take his place as the head of a household. Shudo was a formative but temporary phase of a warrior's life. This tradition, so different from modern Western norms, highlights the complex and culturally specific ways in which the samurai class understood and channeled the powerful forces of love, loyalty, and desire. While the samurai stood as the elite warriors of Japan, they did not fight their battles alone. The great armies of the Sengoku Jidai were composed largely of a new type of soldier, the ashigaru, or light-footed. These were the common foot soldiers drawn from the peasantry who would come to form the backbone of the daimyo's military power. Their rise marked a fundamental shift in Japanese warfare, from the aristocratic cavalry battles of the past to a new era of mass infantry combat. In the early feudal period, warfare was the exclusive domain of the samurai. But as the conflicts of the Sengoku Jidai escalated, the daimyo needed ever larger armies, more men than the samurai class alone could provide. They began to arm the peasantry, at first as temporary levies, but increasingly as permanent professional soldiers. These were the ashigaru. They were not bound by the same code of honor as the samurai. Their relationship with their lord was one of pay and service, not of hereditary feudal loyalty. Initially, the ashigaru were little more than an undisciplined mob, armed with simple bamboo spears and serving as baggage carriers or manual labourers. The samurai looked down on them with contempt, but under innovative commanders like Oda Nobunaga, the Ashigaru were transformed into a disciplined and effective fighting force. They were organised into units based on their weapon. There were units of archers and, most importantly, units of musketeers. As we have seen, it was the Ashigaru standing in disciplined ranks and firing their matchlocks in coordinated volleys who shattered the myth of samurai cavalry invincibility at the Battle of Nagashino. They were also the primary spearmen, a unit of Ashigaru, armed with long pikes and trained to act as a single, cohesive wall of steel, was a formidable defensive force. They were led in battle by samurai officers who were responsible for their training, discipline and morale. The armour of an Ashigaru was much simpler than that of a samurai. He was typically issued a conical iron helmet, or jingasa, and a simple cuirass to protect his torso. His allegiance was displayed on a small banner, or sashimono, that he wore on his back, allowing his commander to identify his unit in the chaos of battle. The life of an Ashigaru was one of hardship and danger, but it also offered a path to social advancement that was otherwise impossible. A commoner who displayed exceptional courage and skill in battle could be rewarded with a grant of land and even be raised to the coveted rank of samurai. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the great unifier who rose from a peasant's son to the de facto ruler of all Japan, was the ultimate, albeit extraordinary, example of this potential. The Ashigaru represent the democratization of warfare in feudal Japan, a pragmatic shift that valued discipline and firepower over aristocratic lineage, and which was a key factor in the eventual unification of the country. In a nation defined by the sea, the samurai were by necessity also warriors of the water. While land battles dominate the popular image of samurai warfare, naval power was often a decisive factor in their long history of conflict. The naval battles of the samurai were not the great cannon duels of European navies. They were something else entirely, floating extensions of a land combat, a chaotic clash of ships that served primarily as platforms for archers and for hand-to-hand fighting. The earliest major naval conflicts took place during the Genpei War in the 12th century. The ships of this era were essentially large open wooden boats, propelled by oarsmen. They were not designed for ramming or sinking other vessels. Instead, they would close with the enemy, and a furious archery duel would ensue. The goal was to clear the enemy's deck with a hail of arrows. Once a ship's fighting crew was thinned out, the ships would be lashed together, and samurai would leap across the rails to engage in brutal sword fights on the crowded, blood-slicked decks. The final battle of the Genpei War, the Battle of Dan-no-Ura, was a massive naval engagement that saw the final destruction of the Taira clan. Centuries later, during the Sengoku Jidai, naval warfare became more sophisticated. The daimyo who controlled coastal domains developed their own fleets, known as kaizoku, who were often little more than glorified pirates pressed into official service. The ships grew larger, with the development of the atakabune, massive, boxy, floating fortresses with wooden walls and small towers from which archers and musketeers could fire down on the enemy. Some daimyo, like Oda Nobunaga, even experimented with iron-clad ships, covering the superstructures of their largest vessels with iron plates to protect them from musket fire and flaming arrows. The greatest test of Japanese naval power came at the end of the 16th century, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched two massive invasions of Korea. He assembled one of the largest naval forces the world had ever seen to transport his vast, samurai armies across the sea. The Japanese fleet, however, met its match in the Korean Navy under the command of the brilliant Admiral Yi Sun-sin. Admiral Yi employed a technologically superior vessel, known as the Turtle Ship, or Geobuxion. These were oar-powered ships with arched, iron-plated roofs that protected the crew from enemy fire, and they were armed with cannons. In a series of stunning victories, Admiral Yi's small fleet repeatedly decimated the much larger Japanese navy, crippling their supply lines and ultimately playing a crucial role in the failure of Hideyoshi's invasions. The samurai, masters of land warfare, had been outthought and outfought on the high seas. The very identity of the samurai was forged on a frontier. Long before they were the refined rulers in Kyoto or Edo, they were rugged warriors tasked with pushing the boundaries of the Japanese state northward into the wild lands of the Tohoku region. This was the land of the Emishi, a tribal people culturally and ethnically distinct from the Japanese of the Yamato court. The centuries-long conflict with these fiercely independent people was the crucible in which the early way of the horse and bow was perfected. The Emishi were skilled guerrilla fighters and brilliant horse archers who used the rugged, mountainous terrain of their homeland to their advantage. The conscript armies sent by the imperial court in the 8th and 9th centuries repeatedly failed to subdue them, melting away in the face of the Emishi's hit-and-run tactics. It was in response to these failures that the court began to rely on the provincial warrior clans, the ancestors of the samurai. These clans adopted the fighting style of their Emishi opponents, mastering the art of mounted archery and developing the flexible, warrior band tactics that were so effective in the northern wilderness. The title that would eventually come to signify the supreme ruler of the samurai, Sei Taishogun, literally means barbarian subduing generalissimo. This title was originally a temporary military commission granted by the emperor to the commander of the armies sent to fight the Emishi. When Minamoto no Yoritomo took this title as the permanent head of his military government, he was explicitly linking his new warrior regime to this long and foundational history of frontier warfare. The samurai's right to rule was rooted in their historical role as the tamers of the wilderness and the defenders of the civilized realm against the barbarians at the gate. This long conflict, often overlooked, is essential to understanding the very genesis of the samurai class. The long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate was not entirely without bloodshed. The new regime's commitment to stability and order was put to a terrifying test in the winter of 1637. On the Shimabara Peninsula, a region near Nagasaki with a large population of Japanese Christians, years of famine, overtaxation, and brutal religious persecution boiled over into a massive rebellion. This was not a samurai uprising, but a popular revolt of peasants, fishermen, and ronin, united by their shared suffering and their Christian faith. The rebels, led by a charismatic 16-year-old boy named Amakusa Shiro, who they believed to be a messiah, fortified themselves in the ruins of Hara Castle, a fortress on a coastal promontory. They numbered nearly 40,000 men, women, and children. They fought under banners emblazoned with Christian crosses and Portuguese slogans, holding out with incredible determination against the massive samurai army that the shogunate sent to crush them. For months, the shogunate's forces, composed of samurai from various domains, were unable to breach the castle's defences. The siege became a source of deep embarrassment for the new warrior government, a sign that their martial skills had perhaps grown rusty in the long years of peace. In its desperation, the shogunate even called upon the help of the Dutch, who were the only Europeans allowed to maintain a trading post in Japan. A Dutch ship was brought in to bombard the castle from the sea with its cannons, an act that did little physical damage but was a profound psychological blow to the rebels. Finally, after months of siege, with the rebels' food and ammunition exhausted, the shogunal army launched a final massive assault. The result was a horrific massacre. The samurai army stormed the castle and systematically slaughtered nearly everyone inside. The heads of the dead were piled up as a grim warning. Amakusa Shiro was beheaded, and his head was put on a pike in Nagasaki. The Shimabara rebellion had a profound and lasting impact. It convinced the shogunate that Christianity was an existential threat to its authority. In the aftermath, the government's policy of national seclusion, sakoku, was fully implemented, and its persecution of Christianity became even more ruthless and systematic. The rebellion stands as a brutal testament to the Tokugawa regime's absolute intolerance of any challenge to its power, and it was one of the last large-scale military actions the samurai would undertake until the final days of their existence 2 centuries later. The figure of the Ronin, the masterless samurai, is one of the most romantic and enduring in Japanese folklore. He is the wandering swordsman, beholden to no master, living by his wits and the skill of his blade. He is Miyamoto Musashi, travelling the land to perfect his art through duels. He is the hero of Kurosawa's Yojimbo, a cynical but ultimately honourable warrior who brings justice to a corrupt town. The reality for the vast majority of Ronin, however, was far from this romantic ideal. It was a life of poverty, desperation, and social limbo. During the chaotic Sengoku Jidai, A samurai might become a ronin if his lord was defeated in battle. He could often find new employment with another daimyo, as skilled warriors were in high demand. But after the Battle of Sekigahara and the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, the situation changed dramatically. Ieyasu dispossessed hundreds of daimyo who had fought against him, and as a result thousands of their samurai retainers were cast adrift. The new, peaceful order had no place for them. There were no wars to fight, and the other domains were not hiring. These men were trapped. They were members of the samurai class, forbidden by law and custom from taking up the work of a farmer or a merchant, yet they had no stipend and no master to serve. Many were forced to sell their precious swords just to survive. They congregated in the major cities, forming a disgruntled and volatile underclass. Some found work as bodyguards for wealthy merchants, or as bouncers in the pleasure quarters. Others opened small fencing schools or worked as mercenaries. But many, driven by poverty and a sense of grievance, turned to crime, forming gangs of bandits and extortionists who terrorized the common people. The shogunate viewed the ronin as a dangerous and destabilizing element, a constant threat to public order. Several major uprisings and plots against the government in the early Edo period were led by ronin. They were a living reminder of the violent past that the Tokugawa regime was so desperate to suppress. While the legend of the 47 ronin celebrated their unwavering loyalty, the government's reaction to their deed, forcing them all to commit seppuku, was also a clear message. Private vendettas and unsanctioned warrior violence would not be tolerated in the new Japan. The romantic image of the noble wanderer obscures a much darker reality of a large and desperate class of men, made obsolete by the very peace their class had created. Beyond the major highways and bustling cities, much of Japan remained a land of dense forests, steep mountains, and secluded valleys. In these remote areas, another kind of warrior, often intertwined with the samurai, held sway: the Sohei, or warrior monks. These were not peaceful ascetics, but powerful, well-armed communities based in the great Buddhist monasteries, particularly those of the Tendai and Shingon sects. For centuries, these monastic complexes functioned as vast, independent feudal domains, commanding their own armies and frequently waging war on each other and against the secular samurai lords. The Sohei were a formidable fighting force. Their ranks included ordained monks, who might fight in their traditional robes with a cowl pulled over their heads, as well as samurai and commoners who were attached to the monastery as lay fighters. Their preferred weapon was often the naginata, its long reach proving deadly in the swirling melees of battle. They were highly disciplined and fought with a religious fanaticism that made them fearsome opponents. The great temple complexes like Enryaku-ji on Mount Hiei overlooking Kyoto and Kofuku-ji in Nara were not just religious centres, but massive, fortified military bases. Throughout the medieval period, the warrior monks were a major political and military power, a constant thorn in the side of both the imperial court and the samurai governments. They would often descend from their mountain fortresses to riot in the streets of the capital, bringing with them a sacred portable shrine, or mikoshi. The authorities were often hesitant to attack the monks for fear of committing sacrilege and incurring the wrath of the Buddhas and kami they served. This gave the Sohei a unique form of political leverage. Their power was finally broken by the great unifier, Oda Nobunaga. In 1571, Nobunaga, who had been repeatedly frustrated by the military and political interference of the warrior monks of Mount Hiei, did the unthinkable. He surrounded the entire mountain with his army, and ignoring all pleas and warnings of divine retribution, he set the entire vast temple complex ablaze. His soldiers were ordered to kill every man, woman and child they found. The massacre of Mount Hiei, in which thousands of monks and civilians perished, was an act of shocking brutality that sent a clear message to the rest of Japan. No religious authority would be allowed to challenge the power of the secular warrior state. It was a decisive and bloody end to the long and turbulent history of the Sohei. The samurai's world was one of meticulous record-keeping and a deep reverence for the written word. This reverence extended to the very paper upon which their histories, laws and poems were written. Japanese paper, known as washi, was a substance of remarkable beauty and durability, a testament to the nation's artistry and even the most humble of materials. Unlike Western paper, which was traditionally made from cotton rags. Washi was crafted from the inner bark of specific trees, most notably the mulberry tree. The process was a painstaking seasonal craft, typically performed in rural communities during the cold winter months when the fibres were at their purest. The bark was harvested, steamed, and then stripped of its outer layers, leaving only the soft white inner fibres. These fibres were then boiled in a lye solution to soften them, and pounded with wooden mallets to break them down. The resulting pulp was mixed with water and a viscous root-based formation aid in a large vat. The papermaker would then dip a flexible bamboo screen into the slurry, lifting it out with a skillful rocking motion that would interlace the long fibres, forming a thin, uniform sheet. Each sheet was then carefully laid on a board to dry in the sun. The resulting paper was incredibly strong, yet soft and translucent, with a delicate organic texture. For the samurai, washi was the medium of culture and administration. It was used for everything from official government decrees to personal letters. It was the surface for the ink paintings and calligraphy that were central to their aesthetic life. The shoji screens that filled their homes were made of washi, filtering the sunlight into a soft, ethereal glow. Samurai women used a soft, absorbent type of washi for facial blotting paper. The very strength and resilience of the paper, its ability to be folded and refolded without tearing, made it a perfect metaphor for the samurai spirit itself, flexible yet unbreakable. While the katana is the most celebrated of the samurai's blades, it was the spear's close cousin, the naginata, that held a unique place in their arsenal and culture. As we have seen, this polearm, with its long wooden shaft and gracefully curved single-edged blade, was the weapon of choice for both the Sohei and the women of the samurai class. Its design was a perfect fusion of the spear's reach and the sword's cutting power. The length of the shaft, which could be up to 8 feet long, allowed a wielder to keep opponents at a distance, while the blade could be used for sweeping cuts, thrusts, and disarming techniques. In the hands of a skilled practitioner, the naginata was a fluid and formidable weapon. Its art, naginata jutsu, involved large circular movements, using the entire body to generate power. It was particularly effective against swordsmen, as its length could control the engagement, and against cavalry, as it could be used to cut a horse's legs or to pull a rider from his saddle. During the early feudal period, it was a common weapon on the battlefield for samurai, but as warfare shifted to massed spear formations in the Sengoku Jidai, its use by men declined. It was then that it became firmly established as the iconic weapon of the samurai woman. For a woman defending a home, the naginata was the great equalizer. It allowed her to use leverage and technique to overcome the superior strength of a male attacker. The image of the loyal wife her naginata held at the ready to defend her family's honor became a powerful symbol in Japanese culture. In the Edo period, naginata jutsu became a martial art practiced almost exclusively by women of the samurai class, a way of instilling discipline and maintaining a connection to their martial heritage. It was a tangible symbol of the quiet strength and unwavering resolve that was expected of them. One of the most powerful tools in the samurai's non-lethal arsenal was the art of geino, or strategic entertainment, particularly the mastery of the no theatre. For the highest-ranking daimyo and the shogun himself, no was not just a refined artistic pastime, it was a sophisticated instrument of political statecraft. To host a no performance was a display of cultural capital and power. Important political negotiations and alliances were often cemented, not in a formal meeting room, but in the quiet, contemplative atmosphere of a private no theatre. The shogun and powerful lords would often learn to perform no themselves, taking to the stage in the lead roles. This was a powerful act of political theatre. By embodying the great heroes and tragic warriors of Japan's mythical past, they were visually and symbolically linking their own rule to a heroic, divinely sanctioned lineage. The slow, dignified pace and profound themes of the plays, loyalty, betrayal, duty, and the transient nature of glory, created an atmosphere of solemnity and gravitas, elevating the political discussions that took place around them. To be invited to perform alongside one's lord was a sign of great favour. To be excluded was a clear sign of his displeasure. In the subtle, power-infused world of the Tokugawa court, The rustle of a silk costume on a cypress stage could be as significant as the drawing of a sword. The samurai worldview was deeply shaped by a sense of place and a sensitivity to the changing seasons. The Japanese archipelago is a land of dramatic natural beauty and equally dramatic natural dangers. This constant, intimate contact with the forces of nature, the beauty of the cherry blossoms, the fury of a typhoon, the terrifying power of an earthquake, instilled a deep appreciation for the impermanence of life, a concept known as mono-no-aware. This pathos of things is a gentle, melancholic awareness of the transient nature of all beauty, and it is a foundational concept in Japanese aesthetics. This sensitivity was expressed in the meticulous celebration of the seasons. A samurai's life was punctuated by seasonal rituals and festivals. In spring, he would participate in hanami, the cherry blossom viewing parties, where he and his comrades would gather under the blooming trees to drink sake, compose poetry, and contemplate the blossom's fleeting beauty, a poignant metaphor for their own short and glorious lives. In autumn, they would gather for tsukimi, moon viewing parties, celebrating the harvest moon with offerings and poetry. This awareness permeated every aspect of their culture. The subject of a painting, the theme of a poem, the flower arrangement in the tokonoma, and even the selection of ingredients in a meal were all chosen to reflect the current season. This was not a trivial matter of decoration. It was a way of living in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world. It provided a sense of order and continuity in a life that was often filled with chaos and uncertainty. For the samurai, to be in tune with the seasons was to be in tune with the fundamental truth of the universe, that all things are beautiful and all things must pass. While the samurai class was officially abolished, their bloodlines, of course, did not vanish. The descendants of the great samurai families are still a part of Japanese society today, though their status is now one of historical interest rather than legal privilege. In the Meiji period, the former daimyo and high-ranking samurai were integrated into a new European-style peerage, the kazoku, becoming dukes, marquesses, and counts. They continued to form a significant portion of Japan's political, military and industrial elite well into the 20th century. The Constitution of 1947 abolished this peerage, making all Japanese citizens commoners. Today, the descendants of the samurai are found in all walks of life. Some families have carefully preserved their lineage, their ancestral swords, armour and documents. There are organisations and societies dedicated to the study and preservation of samurai culture, where descendants gather to honour their heritage. For many, their name is a quiet source of pride, a connection to a deep and complex history. The 38th head of the Tokugawa clan, Tsunenari Tokugawa for example, worked for many years as a shipping executive. The descendants of the warrior class have adapted and assimilated, their story now a part of the much larger story of modern Japan. The Sengoku Jidai, the age of the country at war, was a period of intense innovation, not just in military tactics, but in the art of intelligence and counterintelligence. The great daimyo understood that a battle could be won or lost long before the first arrow was fired. They employed a sophisticated network of spies and agents to gather information on their rivals. These were the Rappa and Kusa, the rustlers and the grass, agents who would infiltrate an enemy's domain, often disguised as merchants, monks, or travelling performers, to map its terrain, assess the morale of its troops, and identify potential traitors within its ranks. Communication over long distances was a critical challenge. Runners were used for short distances, but for urgent messages a system of signal fires was established on mountaintops, allowing a simple message, such as the sighting of an enemy army, to be relayed across a province with incredible speed. Written messages were often composed in complex codes or ciphers to prevent them from being read if intercepted. Sometimes, a message would be written in tiny characters on a thin piece of paper, which was then rolled up and hidden inside a rice ball for a messenger to eat if he was in danger of being captured. Deception was a high art. A daimyo might deliberately spread false rumours of a planned attack on one flank to draw his enemy's forces there, while his real army prepared to strike on the other. Ninja were used to infiltrate enemy camps and spread dissent or panic. This constant atmosphere of espionage and mistrust, this war of the belly, harage, as the Japanese would call it, where one's true intentions were always hidden, was as much a part of the conflict as the open clash of armies. The most successful samurai leaders were not just brave warriors, but master psychologists and cunning spy masters. The samurai, for all their stoicism, had a deep appreciation for the pleasures of recreation and games. These were not idle pastimes, but activities that were seen as ways to cultivate strategic thinking, discipline, and a refined aesthetic sense. One of the most popular games among the elite was Go, a board game of profound strategic complexity. Played with black and white stones on a grid, the goal is to surround and capture the opponent's territory. Go is not a game of quick attacks, but of long-term strategy, of building influence, and of seeing the larger pattern of the board. It was considered a perfect training ground for the military mind, a way to hone a samurai's ability to think several moves ahead. Another popular game was shogi, or Japanese chess. Like its Western counterpart, it is a game of strategy and tactics, with pieces like kings, generals, and lances. A unique feature of shogi, however, is the drop rule. A captured piece can be returned to the board to fight for the player who captured it. This makes the game incredibly dynamic and complex, with the balance of power able to shift dramatically at any moment. For more physical recreation, samurai engaged in activities like falconry or takagari. This was a prestigious sport, a display of wealth and skill. A samurai would train a hawk or a falcon to hunt pheasants or other game, a process that required immense patience and a deep understanding of the bird's nature. Another popular and more brutal sport was inumino, a form of mounted archery where groups of samurai would compete to shoot specially designed, non-lethal arrows at dogs in an enclosed arena. While abhorrent to modern sensibilities, it was considered excellent practice for the skills of a mounted archer. These games and pastimes were a vital part of the samurai's life, a way of sharpening the mind and body even in times of peace. In the rigid social structure of feudal Japan, the samurai class itself was far from a monolithic entity. It was a complex and deeply stratified hierarchy, a pyramid of rank and status where a man's position determined his income, his duties, and the level of respect he was accorded. At the very apex of this pyramid was the shogun, the military dictator who was the de facto ruler of the country. Below him were the great daimyo, the feudal lords who ruled their own domains, or han. The daimyo were themselves ranked. The most powerful were the shinpan, relatives of the Tokugawa family, followed by the Feudai, the hereditary vassals who had been allied with the Tokugawa before the Battle of Sekigahara, and finally the Tozama, the outside lords who had submitted to Tokugawa rule only after the Great Battle, and who were always regarded with a degree of suspicion. Within each daimyo's domain, the samurai retainers were further stratified. At the top were the karo, the domain elders, who acted as the lord's chief ministers and advisors. Below them were the rank-and-file samurai, the kashi, who performed the bulk of the military and administrative duties. This group was subdivided into numerous ranks based on their family's historical contributions and their rice stipend. At the very bottom of the samurai pyramid were the goshi, or country samurai, who were part-time warriors and part-time farmers, living in rural areas rather than in the castle town. This rigid hierarchy governed every aspect of a samurai's life. His rank dictated the size and location of his house, the materials his clothes could be made from, the type of gait he was allowed to have, and even the kind of palanquin he could ride in. A lower-ranking samurai meeting a higher-ranking one on the road was expected to dismount and perform a deep bow. This intricate system of status was designed to ensure order and prevent the kind of ambitious overreach that had characterized the chaotic Sengoku Jidai. It created a stable, but also a deeply conservative and often stifling society, where a man's worth was determined not by his ability, but by the station of his birth. The final dying embers of the samurai age were not extinguished at the Battle of Shirayama, but in a conflict that took place 2 decades later, far from Japan's shores. In 1894, a newly modernized and ambitious Japan went to war with its giant neighbor China over influence in Korea. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy that fought this war were a world away from the feudal armies of the past. They were a professional conscripted force, armed with modern artillery and steel battleships, and trained in the latest European military doctrines. The men who led them, however, were almost all of the former samurai class. They were men who had traded their katana for a Western-style saber and their armour for a tailored uniform, but who still carried the martial spirit and the strategic discipline of their ancestors. The Sino-Japanese War was a stunning and decisive victory for Japan. The modern military that the Meiji oligarchs had built proved to be vastly superior to the antiquated forces of the Qing dynasty. In a series of swift land and naval battles, the Japanese army overran Korea and pushed into Manchuria, while the navy annihilated the Chinese fleet. The victory shocked the world. It announced Japan's arrival as a major military power on the global stage and shattered the old Sino-centric order in East Asia. For the former samurai who had orchestrated the Meiji Restoration, this was the ultimate validation of their painful and revolutionary path. They had dismantled their own class, abandoned their most cherished traditions, and endured the humiliation of foreign encroachment, all in the service of a single goal: to build a Japan that was strong enough to stand on its own feet and defend itself against the West. The victory against China proved they had succeeded. The spirit of the samurai, they believed, had not died. It had been reborn, transformed from a feudal warrior ethos into the engine of a modern, powerful nation-state. It was a final, triumphant, and ultimately tragic legacy. The samurai's deep connection to the natural world found a unique expression in their relationship with horses. For the early warriors of the Heian and Kamakura periods, the horse was not just a mode of transport, it was a partner in battle, an extension of the warrior's own body. The native Japanese horse was a relatively small, sturdy and agile breed, well suited to the mountainous terrain of the country. A samurai's skill as a horseman, his ability to control his mount with his knees while loosing a volley of arrows, was the very measure of his worth as a warrior. The care and training of a horse was a specialized art. A samurai's horse was a valuable and cherished possession. Its tack was often elaborately decorated, with lacquered saddles inlaid with mother-of-pearl and stirrups of finely worked iron. Great war horses were given names and were celebrated in chronicles and epic tales for their strength and courage. The bond between a warrior and his steed was one of mutual trust and dependence. The practice of yabusame, or mounted archery, is a living testament to this ancient tradition. Yabusame is a Shinto ritual in which a samurai, clad in the full, classic armour of the Kamakura period, gallops at high speed down a long track, attempting to shoot 3 blunt-headed arrows at 3 wooden targets. To hit all 3 targets while controlling a galloping horse is a feat of incredible skill, requiring perfect balance, timing, and concentration. Today, yabusame is preserved as a sacred ceremony, a spectacular and beautiful reminder of the distant past when the way of the horse and bow was the heart and soul of the samurai's existence. While the samurai class was officially a secular warrior aristocracy, its history is interwoven with that of one of the most fervent and militant Buddhist movements in Japanese history, the Iko-Ikki. This was a popular religious movement, based on the teachings of Pure Land Buddhism, that became a massive political and military force in the 15th and 16th centuries. Its followers, who included peasants, monks, and lower-ranking samurai, believed that all people were equal in the eyes of the Amida Buddha and that salvation could be achieved through faith alone. This egalitarian message was a direct challenge to the hierarchical feudal order. The Iko-Ikki were not just a religious sect, they were a formidable military power. They rose up in a series of massive rebellions, overthrowing the samurai rulers of entire provinces and establishing their own form of theocratic rule. Their main fortress was the Ishiyama Honganji, a massive fortified cathedral city built in what is now the heart of Osaka. Their armies were composed of fanatically devoted followers who believed that to die fighting for their faith would guarantee them immediate rebirth in the Pure Land paradise. They were notoriously difficult to defeat, their morale seemingly unbreakable. For nearly a century, the Iko-Ikki were a major obstacle to the unification of Japan. It took the genius and brutality of Oda Nobunaga to finally crush them. From 1570 to 1580, Nobunaga waged a relentless decade-long war against their main stronghold at Ishiyama Honganji. The siege was one of the longest and most difficult in Japanese history. Finally, through a combination of naval blockades, relentless attacks, and negotiated settlements, the fortress cathedral surrendered. Nobunaga burned it to the ground. The destruction of the Ikoiki's power base marked another key victory for the secular warrior lords over the independent religious powers, paving the way for a unified Japan under the absolute rule of the samurai class. The image of the samurai is inextricably linked with that of the cherry blossom, or sakura. This is no mere poetic fancy. The symbolism of the cherry blossom was a core element of the samurai's worldview, a beautiful and poignant reflection of their understanding of life and death. The cherry tree blooms with a stunning, almost overwhelming beauty for a very short period, typically no more than a week or two. Then, at the peak of its beauty, the petals do not wither and die on the branch. They are scattered by the wind, falling to the earth in a graceful snow-like shower. For the samurai, this was the ideal way to live and, more importantly, the ideal way to die. A warrior's life, they believed, should be like the cherry blossom, lived with brilliance, purity and intensity, but also with a constant awareness of its own brevity. He should not cling to life, but be ready to sacrifice it at any moment for his lord or for his honour, falling in the prime of his life, just as the blossom falls at the peak of its beauty. The famous phrase, Hana wa sakuragi, hito wa bushi, translates as of flowers the cherry blossom, of men the warrior. It means that just as the cherry blossom is the finest of all flowers, the warrior is the noblest of all men. This symbolism permeated their culture. Cherry blossom motifs adorned their armour, their sword fittings, and their lacquerware. The annual ritual of Hanami was a time for both celebration and deep philosophical reflection. As they sat beneath the blooming trees, the samurai were reminded of the beauty and the transience of their own existence. This embrace of impermanence, this ability to find a tragic beauty in a short life and a noble death, was a source of great spiritual strength. It was what allowed them to face the constant presence of death not with fear, but with a sense of calm, aesthetic acceptance. In the shadow of the great castles and temples, the life of the common people of feudal Japan unfolded. The vast majority of the population were farmers, their lives tied to the endless cyclical rhythm of planting and harvesting rice. Their existence was one of hard labour and deep reverence for the land. The village was the central unit of their society, a close-knit community governed by a council of elders. Life was communal, with families helping each other during the busy planting and harvest seasons. Religion, for the common people, was a syncretic blend of Shinto agricultural rites to appease the local kami and ensure a good harvest, and Buddhist funeral practices and beliefs about the afterlife. The relationship between the peasantry and the samurai was one of both dependence and fear. The samurai were their rulers and protectors, but they were also the tax collectors who took a significant portion of their hard-earned crop. The farmers were at the bottom of a vast pyramid of exploitation, their labour supporting the entire warrior class. While officially respected, they were often treated with contempt. Samurai edicts often dictated what they could wear, simple cotton only, what they could eat. They were forbidden from consuming the rice they grew, subsisting on millet and other lesser grains, and how they should behave. They were expected to bow deeply and show absolute deference to any samurai. Yet the peasantry was not always a passive, subservient mass. When taxes became too high or famine struck, they would sometimes rise up in desperate, violent revolts known as iki. Armed with sharpened bamboo spears and farming implements, thousands of peasants would march on their lord's castle, demanding tax relief or the dismissal of a corrupt official. These uprisings were almost always brutally suppressed, their leaders executed in the cruelest ways imaginable. But they were a constant simmering threat, a reminder to the samurai that their power rested on a fragile foundation, and that the quiet, toiling masses could, if pushed too far, become a powerful and destructive force. The samurai's world was a world of sound and silence. The soundscape of feudal Japan was profoundly different from our own, a mix of natural sounds and the carefully controlled sounds of human activity. The silence of a Zen temple garden, broken only by the chirping of a cricket or the rhythmic thwack of a bamboo water feature, or shishiodoshi, was a cultivated stillness, a sound designed to deepen the silence around it. The gentle rustle of silk as a person moved through a room, the soft thump of feet on tatami mats, these were the sounds of peace. But there was also the music of the samurai. Their taste often favoured instruments that had a lonely, contemplative quality. The shakuhachi, a simple, end-blown bamboo flute, was particularly associated with Zen Buddhism. Its haunting, breathy tones were considered a form of meditation, a practice known as suizen, or blowing Zen. A master could evoke the sound of the wind sighing through pine trees, or the cry of a wild goose with just a few, perfectly controlled notes. Another key instrument was the biwa, a pear-shaped lute, which was used by travelling storytellers to accompany their recitations of great war epics like the Tale of the Heike. The dramatic twanging chords of the biwa, combined with the chanted tales of heroism and tragedy, were the soundtrack to the samurai's own heroic history. The sounds of war were a different matter entirely. They were designed to instill courage in allies and terror in enemies. The most iconic sound was the horogai, a large conch shell trumpet. Each commander had a specific sequence of blasts that were used to signal commands across the battlefield: advance, retreat, rally. The deep booming moan of the horogai was a chilling sound that signalled the start of a charge. Accompanying this were the great taiko drums, massive drums beaten with thick wooden sticks to create a thunderous, earth-shaking rhythm. The beat of the taiko was the heartbeat of the army, used to keep soldiers in step as they marched and to drive them forward in the heat of battle. It was a primal, visceral sound that spoke of discipline, power, and the coming of death. The art of concealment was a vital, if dishonourable part of the samurai's world, but there was also an art of being seen. The samurai understood the power of symbols and visual communication, especially on the chaotic battlefield. This was the role of the sashimono and the umajirushi. The sashimono was a small banner bearing the crest of the samurai's lord or his unit, which was attached to the back of his armour with a special bracket. In the swirling melee of a battle, where faces were obscured by helmets and masks, the sashimono was a crucial tool for identification, allowing a commander to distinguish friend from foe and to track the movements of his troops. Even more important was the umajirushi, or horse insignia. These were the massive three-dimensional battle standards of the great daimyo. They were far more elaborate than simple flags. An umajirushi might be a giant golden fan, a cluster of Buddhist prayer beads the size of cannonballs, or a huge lacquered gourd. These standards were carried into battle by a dedicated standard bearer and were placed next to the daimyo at his field headquarters. They were a rallying point for the army, and a clear indicator of the commander's location. These standards became symbols of the daimyo themselves. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's was his 1,000-gourd standard, while Tokugawa Ieyasu's was a simple but elegant golden fan. The fall of a daimyo's umajirushi in battle was a catastrophic blow to morale, a clear sign that the commander had been killed or was in retreat. Capturing an enemy standard was a great honour. This battlefield heraldry was a vibrant, visual language, a way of imposing order and identity onto the brutal chaos of war, and a testament to the samurai belief that even in the midst of slaughter, symbolism and beauty had their place. As the Meiji era progressed, the legacy of the samurai found a new and unexpected champion in the person of Nitobe Inazo. A Christian, an educator, and a diplomat who had spent many years in the West, Nitobe was concerned by the perception of Japan in the eyes of foreigners. To explain the moral foundations of his culture to a Western audience, he wrote a short book in English, published in 1900, titled Bushido, The Soul of Japan. The book was an enormous international success. It presented a romanticised and highly idealised vision of the samurai code, equating it with the chivalry of the European knights and presenting it as the source of the Japanese people's character. Nitobe's Bushido was a synthesis of samurai ethics with Christian and Western philosophical concepts. He described virtues like integrity, courage, and honour in terms that were easily understandable to a Western reader, drawing parallels to everything from the Bible to Shakespeare. It was this book, more than any other single text, that introduced the concept of Bushido to the world and cemented the image of the samurai as a noble, spiritual warrior, a knight of the Orient. Ironically, the book was not as influential in Japan until it was translated back into Japanese. It then became a key part of the nationalistic ideology of the early 20th century. While modern historians criticise Nitobe's work for its historical inaccuracies and for glossing over the darker, more violent aspects of samurai reality, its impact is undeniable. It was a masterful act of cultural translation that defined the popular image of the samurai for generations, both abroad and at home. It demonstrates how the legacy of the samurai was not a fixed thing, but a fluid concept, constantly being reinterpreted and reimagined to serve the needs of the present. The story of the samurai is, in many ways, a story of steel. But it is also a story of fire, and not just the fire of the forge or the battlefield. From the earliest days of Japanese civilization, fire has been both a creative and a devastatingly destructive force. The cities of feudal Japan were built almost entirely of wood, paper and thatch. While this made them resilient to earthquakes, it also made them incredibly vulnerable to fire. A small accidental blaze fanned by the wind could quickly grow into a raging inferno, consuming entire city blocks in a matter of hours. The great city of Edo was particularly notorious for its fires. It was said that fires and quarrels are the flowers of Edo. Major city-destroying conflagrations were a regular occurrence, the most devastating of which was the Great Fire of Miraki in 1657, which burned for 3 days and destroyed more than half the city, killing an estimated 100,000 people. In response to this constant threat, the Tokugawa shogunate organised the first professional, full-time fire brigades, the Hikashi. These were not samurai, but commoners, often steeplejacks and construction workers, known for their agility, strength and fearlessness. They were organised into brigades with a quasi-military structure, each with its own distinctive uniform and magnificent banner, or matoi. Their method of firefighting was not to extinguish the flames with water, which was often in short supply, but to contain the fire's spread. They would race ahead of the blaze and, using long hooks and pikes, tear down the houses in its path, creating a fire break. It was a dangerous, destructive, but necessary job. The Hikashi, with their elaborate tattoos and swaggering bravado, became folk heroes, the daredevil guardians of the wooden city, their courage a commoner's echo of the samurai's own martial spirit. The samurai's journey through life was bookended by two of the most important relationships in his world, the bond with his wet nurse and the bond with his page. In the households of high-ranking samurai, it was common for a child to be given over to the care of a wet nurse, or minoto. This woman, often from a lower-ranking samurai family, would not only nurse the infant but would often remain a central figure in his life, a source of unwavering loyalty and maternal affection. The bond between a lord and his wet nurse's family could be incredibly strong, often more powerful than ties of blood. The Minoto's own sons, who had shared their mother's milk with their young master, were known as Minuto Go and often became the lord's most trusted and loyal retainers, his childhood companions who would follow him into death. As a young samurai began his training, he would be assigned a page, or kosho. This was a younger boy, often from a retainer's family who served as his personal attendant. The kosho's duties were varied. He cared for his master's swords, helped him dress in his armour, and accompanied him into battle, acting as a messenger and a bodyguard. The relationship was an intensely personal and hierarchical one. It was the training ground for the absolute loyalty that was expected of a retainer. A page learned by observing his master, and a master learned to command by leading his page. This was often the context for the idealised love of Shudo. The most famous and tragic of these relationships was that between Oda Nobunaga and his page, Mori Ranmaru, who fought by his master's side and ultimately perished with him in the flames of the Honnoji temple. The story of the samurai is overwhelmingly an internal one, a Japanese story told by and for the Japanese. But for a brief, fascinating moment, we are granted a glimpse of this world through the eyes of an outsider, an astonished witness from a completely different reality. In the year 1600, just months before the decisive Battle of Sekigahara, a Dutch ship, the Liefde, limped to the shores of Japan, its crew sick and dying. Its English pilot, a man named William Adams, was brought before the powerful daimyo who would soon become shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu. For Adams, a man from Elizabethan England, stepping into late Sengoku Japan was like stepping onto another planet. He encountered a society of bewildering customs, of profound politeness, and sudden, shocking violence. He saw a people whose relationship with cleanliness, art and death was utterly alien to his own. But Ieyasu, a man of immense curiosity and pragmatism, saw in Adams not a barbarian, but a living tool. He was fascinated by Adams' knowledge of shipbuilding, navigation and European politics. Adams was forbidden from leaving Japan, and over the years he was transformed. Ieyasu made him a samurai, granting him a fief, 2 swords and a Japanese name, Miura Anjin. He became a trusted advisor to the shogun, a man who had crossed the ultimate cultural divide. His letters and his story provide an invaluable, if limited, mirror, reflecting back at us the astounding, intricate and often inscrutable world of the samurai, as it appeared to one who was never born to it. The intricate legal framework that governed the Tokugawa peace was a 2-tiered system, with one set of laws for the warriors and another for the commoners. The samurai were governed by the Bukushohato, or laws for the military houses, a series of edicts issued by the shogunate that regulated every aspect of a daimyo's life, from castle repairs to marriage alliances. It was the legal mechanism that enforced policies like alternate attendance. For the common people, justice was administered by samurai magistrates. In a great city like Edo, the Machibugyo, or city administrator, was one of the most powerful officials in the land. He was the chief of police, the prosecutor, and the judge, all rolled into one. His office, the Bugyosho, was a place of immense fear and authority, where the fate of commoners was decided. This legal dualism was the bedrock of the Tokugawa state, a system designed to control the ambitions of the powerful warriors at the top, while ensuring the absolute submission of the masses at the bottom. To navigate this highly regulated and hierarchical society, a samurai had to master the delicate art of balancing his public face with his private self. This was the distinction between a mote and uchi. A mote refers to the front, the public facade, the formal and ritualized behavior that was required in the presence of one's lord or social superiors. It was a world of perfect etiquette, of carefully chosen words and suppressed emotions, where one's every action was a performance of their social role. Uchi, in contrast, was the inside, the private world of one's home and family. It was a space where the rigid social mask could be relaxed, where one could speak more freely and behave with greater informality. This constant distinction was not seen as hypocrisy, but as a necessary skill for maintaining social harmony. A samurai's life was a continuous negotiation between the demands of his public duty and the realities of his private heart, a tension that defined his existence and was the source of both his strength and his greatest tragedies. Beneath the grand political and social structures of the samurai world lay the complex and often confusing machinery of its economy. While a samurai's wealth was officially measured in koku of rice, the vibrant urban culture of the Edo period ran on hard currency. The Tokugawa shogunate established a national tripartite monetary system. The gold standard, used for large transactions and official government payments, was based on the oblong oban and smaller koban coins. The silver standard, based on coins valued by weight, was the primary currency of commerce in the western part of Japan, centered on Osaka, and for everyday transactions there was a vast circulation of copper and bronze coins, known as mon or zeni, which were often strung together in long chains. The exchange rates between these 3 metals fluctuated constantly, creating a complex financial market that was dominated by a new class of specialists, the money changers. These merchants, with their abacuses and keen understanding of the market, became the unofficial bankers of the samurai class, their growing wealth a tangible sign of the slow, inexorable shift from a feudal agrarian economy to a modern commercial one. The final confrontation between the old world and the new was not just one of men and weapons, but of information. When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived, they brought not only cannons but the telegraph. The samurai leaders who orchestrated the Meiji Restoration were quick to understand that modern warfare and modern governance ran on the speed of information. One of their first and most revolutionary acts was the construction of a national telegraph network, linking the major cities. The clicking of the telegraph key was the death knell of the old slow world of messengers and signal fires. News of a political decision in Tokyo could now reach Nagasaki in minutes, not weeks. This ability to communicate and coordinate in real time was a crucial tool that allowed the small group of Meiji oligarchs to consolidate their power, to direct their new conscript army with unprecedented efficiency, and to stamp out the last vestiges of regional samurai resistance. The telegraph line stretching alongside the old Tokaido Road was the ultimate symbol of the new era. A thin copper wire that carried a current powerful enough to electrocute a 700-year-old way of life. As the samurai class faded into history, their material culture was scattered to the winds. In the early Meiji period, many impoverished samurai families were forced to sell their ancestral treasures, their swords, their armour, their lacquered saddles, for a fraction of their worth. Much of this exquisite craftsmanship was bought up by foreign visitors and merchants who were captivated by the exotic beauty of Japanese art. This led to the great outflow of samurai art to the museums and private collections of Europe and America. Suits of armour that had once seen battle at Sekigahara now stood as silent sentinels in the halls of English manors. Blades forged by legendary smiths, once the soul of a warrior, became decorative objects in Parisian salons. It was a tragic dispersal, a selling off of a nation's soul. Yet it was this very dispersal that was instrumental in introducing the West to the profound aesthetic sensibilities of the samurai, preserving their legacy on a global stage even as it was being dismantled in its homeland.